Chapter 625. At 6:30 p.m. Eric walked out of the studio where the Victoria's Secret show was located. He had too many things to do. If it wasn't for the dinner appointment with Buffett and the others, Eric might have worked overtime until 8 p.m. The driver and his new assistant, Kelly Haynes, were already waiting outside. Eric and Kelly Haynes got into their car together. The driver started the car and drove to the appointed restaurant. "Mr. Williams, this is the document you need. I have already made 4 copies." Kelly Haynes handed the document from the morning to Eric again. Eric thanked her and took the folder to read it carefully. Although she had been Eric's assistant for a few weeks, this was the first time Kelly Haynes was in the same car as Eric. After a few minutes, the female assistant finally relaxed. She inadvertently glanced at the young boss beside her and was suddenly lost in thought. After the box office of The Lion King was released, Kelly Haynes heard that Eric was going to close down Disney's hand-drawn animation department. Like many people, she thought that Eric must be crazy. However, in the past few days, under Eric's instructions, Kelly Haynes led her team to sort out the document in Eric's hands. She suddenly felt that if she were in his shoes, she would definitely close down Disney's hand-drawn animation department. This document was too persuasive. She couldn't find a reason to refute it. At the same time, Kelly Haynes was also shocked by her big boss's keen insight. At first glance, many of the data in this document didn't seem to have much connection. However, when put together, they formed a very strong chain of evidence. Kelly Haynes couldn't help but think that perhaps it was this keen insight that allowed him to produce one hit movie after another. As Eric read the document in his hand, he smelled the strong scent of Chanel No. 5 perfume beside him. He could feel that this beautiful female assistant had been staring at him for at least a minute. This made him feel a little uncomfortable. Eric was not narcissistic enough to think that he had the charm to make a mature neodymium woman fall head over heels for him. Moreover, the problem in Kelly Haynes' mind was nothing to Eric. If Eric had not been reborn, it would have been difficult for him to see the decline of 2D animation. However, with the memories of his previous life, he could make a reverse inference based on the results. It was enough for him to discover the reason why a series of 2D animation movies were bound to decline. After reading through more than half of the documents, Eric finally couldn't resist the gaze of the woman beside him. He moved his body and turned his head to glance at Kelly Haynes' left hand. He didn't discover a wedding ring. Eric's sudden movement also woke Kelly Haynes up. She hurriedly retracted her gaze. She realized what she had just done and felt an inexplicable sense of panic. Eric felt the woman's panic. In order to avoid the awkwardness, he placed his gaze back on the document and said casually, "Kelly, let me ask you a rather abrupt question. Are you married?" Kelly Haynes' face turned slightly red. She subconsciously wanted to retort that he was asking a question even though he knew it was abrupt. However, when the words reached her mouth, they turned into another answer. "Yes, I was married once. However, I got divorced. I'm living with my daughter now. Her name is Nina. She's 7 years old this year." "I'm sorry for delaying your dinner time with your daughter." Kelly Haynes shook her head and smiled. "It's okay. Nina is very sensible. Moreover, she has a nanny with her." The simple conversation dissolved the slightly awkward atmosphere between the two. Eric could feel the uneasiness of the female assistant. In order to prevent the car from falling into silence again, he took the initiative to ask, "Do you like Chanel No. 5 very much?" Kelly Haynes didn't expect Eric to be able to directly say the name of the perfume she used. She recalled some of the subconscious motives she had when she first chose this perfume. Her expression became a little unnatural again. "Me. A good friend recommended it. I've only started to try it recently. I feel that it's okay." Kelly Haynes tried her best to make her tone sound natural. Eric didn't notice anything strange. He said, "Although Chanel No. 5 matches your aura very well, this perfume is most suitable to be used at parties. In daily work, a light perfume would be more suitable." "I'll consider your suggestion, Mr. Williams," Kelly Haynes replied in a low voice. She felt a little embarrassed and nervous. Since Eric knew this perfume so well, then he should also know some of the special effects of this perfume, such as Chweiching. Eric's gaze never left the document in his hand. He was just casually chatting. Therefore, he didn't notice the strange expression that flashed across Kelly Haynes' face just now. He felt the female assistant's voice turn soft, and thought that she was a little resistant to his suggestion. He raised his head to look at her and said, "I'm sorry, I just said it casually. You don't have to take it to heart. If you like it, you can continue to use it." "Of course not." Kelly Haynes shook her head and said, "I also feel that this perfume is a little too ostentatious. I plan to change it soon." Eric closed the last page of the document and said, "Oh, that's good. Actually, I prefer a woman's natural body fragrance. This is where a woman's innate charm lies. Just like you. I feel that if you don't use any perfume now, it would be more," Eric said casually. This time, he finally noticed that Kelly Haynes' face had turned red. He quickly stopped the topic and said, "I'm really sorry. I'm not harassing you. It's just that." Kelly Haynes saw Eric's slightly embarrassed expression and suddenly became bold. She continued Eric's words and teased, "It's just a playboy's natural habit of coaxing women?" Eric smiled bitterly and nodded. He also realized something and said, "It seems that I've been talking about an unpleasant topic just now." Kelly Haynes smiled and said, "You finally realized it. I thought that it was the inherent flaw of a genius EQ. I'm not a genius." Eric shook his head. Just as he was about to continue speaking, the car stopped in front of an ordinary Italian restaurant. Eric looked at the restaurant outside the window and asked, "Is it here?" Kelly Haynes took out the memo and confirmed it. She said, "Yes, it's here." Noticing Eric's confusion, Kelly Haynes explained, "This should be chosen by Mr. Buffett. He has always been more thrifty." Eric knew that the word Kelly Haynes really wanted to use was stingy, because the whole world knew about Buffett's stingy character. After getting out of the car with the document, Eric looked at the female assistant who was still sitting in the car and suddenly asked, "Why don't you come together? If you're not in a hurry to go home and accompany your daughter?" Kelly Haynes was a little tempted, but she looked at her professional suit and shook her head. "I think I'd better not. My current attire is not suitable for a banquet." Eric pointed at the Italian restaurant behind him and smiled. "Do you think that an old man who can choose such a restaurant will care about what the guests wear?" Kelly Haynes laughed and got out of the car graciously. The two of them walked into the restaurant. Eric looked around and was glad that he did not see Buffett and the other two in the lobby. It was mealtime now. Not to mention the need to keep the topic of the conversation confidential. Eric believed that if they ate in the lobby, they would not be able to finish the meal before they were surrounded by the reporters. After exchanging a few words with the waiter, the two of them were brought to a private room. When Warren Buffett, Tom Murphy, and David West saw Eric coming in, they stopped talking and stood up. Eric shook hands with the three of them and said, "I'm really sorry, everyone. I've been too busy with work recently, so I couldn't personally pick you up from the airport." "It's okay. Work is the most important thing," Buffett said with a smile. Tom Murphy and David West both nodded in agreement. Eric introduced Kelly Haynes to them, and the five of them sat down. The waiter did not recognize Buffett and the other two old men at first and thought that they were just ordinary guests. However, he definitely knew Eric and recalled Buffett's identity. Looking at the few big shots sitting in front of him, the waiter was a little excited. At the same time, he could not help but calculate how much tip he would get later. He said eagerly, "Gentlemen, would you like to order now?" Buffett and the other two did not finish their words and looked at Eric together. Eric smiled at the waiter and said, "Sorry, can we order after 15 minutes? We still have some things to discuss." Of course, no problem, Mr. Williams. Anytime." The waiter was a little flattered by Eric's tone of discussion. He nodded with a silly smile and took the initiative to leave the room. After the waiter left, Eric took out the folder that he always carried with him. Kelly Haynes took the initiative to stand up and clean up the tableware on the table, before sitting down quietly beside Eric. After handing the photocopied documents to the three of them, Eric said with a smile, "In order to have a more enjoyable dinner, I think we still have to solve this problem first." Among the three of them, David West, who was 55 years old, was the youngest. As the president of a large foundation, he was also the most sociable. Therefore, he agreed with Eric's joke and smiled. The other two old men could not wait to open the documents and read them. Tom Murphy even put on his reading glasses seriously. Eric looked at Buffett, who had quickly turned the first page, and said, "I believe that after reading these documents and data, everyone will definitely be able to understand something, but I'd better explain it myself. It will be simpler and clearer." Buffett had an extraordinary ability to read and calculate data quickly. However, after quickly reading the first article, The Trend of Comprehensive Distribution of Hollywood Movies, Buffett did not see any factors related to Eric's upcoming closure of Disney's hand-drawn animation department. Hearing Eric's words, Buffett decisively stopped flipping the pages and looked at the confident Eric. The other two also paused their movements. Eric sorted out his thoughts and said, "First of all, I want to make it clear that The Lion King is an event movie similar to Star Wars, E.T., and Home Alone." Sensing that the three of them were confused by the term event movie, Eric could only continue to explain. The so-called event movie is a movie whose box office far exceeds the early projections of the movie company. The appearance of this kind of movie is full of accidents. Perhaps you won't encounter one in 10 or 20 years. Strictly speaking, even my film last year, Jurassic Park, can't be considered an event movie. The success of Jurassic Park can only be regarded as the expansion of the global box office market, and the inevitable trend of large-scale CG special effects films being favored by the audience. In the next few years, there will definitely be more CG special effects films with a global box office of more than $1 billion. David West asked, "Eric, since you said that Jurassic Park is the inevitable trend of the market's development, then why can't The Lion King be regarded as a normal performance of the market's demand for animated films?" Because before Jurassic Park, we have already seen some clues from the box office market reaction of Terminator 2 and Tornado. The global box office of Terminator 2 is $500 million. The global box office of Tornado should be close to $700 million, right? Eric looked at Kelly Haynes, who was next to him when he said the last sentence. Kelly Haynes was looking at Eric's eloquent speech with some excitement. When she saw him suddenly turn to her, she inexplicably remembered what Eric said in the morning. "I like women who are sensitive to numbers." She instantly felt her heartbeat accelerate a lot. However, the female assistant still reported a number without hesitation. According to the final statistics, the global box office of Tornado has a total of $688 million. It's less than $12 million to $700 million. Eric nodded and turned to the three people opposite him and said, "Terminator 2 has a global box office of $500 million, Tornado has a global box office of $700 million, and Jurassic Park has a global box office of $1 billion. These figures should be able to prove the trend of the market's development. However, in terms of 2D animated films, I don't see this trend at all. The corresponding analysis is in this document, and you will see it later." Although David West, who raised the question, was somewhat unwilling, he found that he could not refute it. Warren Buffett nodded slightly and motioned to Eric. "Eric, please continue." Then, to confirm that The Lion King is an event film that is difficult to replicate, let's first look at an important change in Hollywood's film distribution model in recent years. As Eric spoke, he flipped open the document in his hand and said, "After Jaws appeared for the first time in 1975, after 2 decades, this distribution model has been recognized by Hollywood. However, before the 90s, the distribution model and the long-term distribution model still coexisted in commercial films. You can see this in the statistics table in this document." After leaving some time for them to look at the data, Eric continued, "But with the advent of the 90s, an upgraded version of the distribution strategy rapidly emerged. In recent years, there has been a special term, full-scale distribution. This distribution model is more radical than the traditional distribution model. The film company invests a huge amount of money in the early stage to conduct large-scale advertising campaigns. After accumulating enough influence, they immediately open 2,000 to 3,000 cinemas. Under normal circumstances, they can obtain about 80% to 90% of the total box office through 8 weeks of screening. However, 10 years ago, take Universal's Back to the Future as an example. The 8-week cumulative box office of this film was only 57% of the total box office. Even because of the reputation of the first film, the 8-week cumulative box office of the second film, Raiders of the Lost Ark 2, was only 77% of the total box office. The screening time of Back to the Future and Raiders of the Lost Ark 2 is also very interesting. Back to the Future was screened for a total of 37 weeks, while Raiders of the Lost Ark 2 was screened for only 20 weeks. We can see from the document that the screening time of the full-scale distribution films in recent years has been significantly shortened compared to the 1980s. The greatly shortened screening time means that the cinemas can free up more time and canvas to arrange more films. The rapid rise of the box office in Hollywood in recent years has a lot to do with the popularity of this model. Therefore, full-scale distribution will be the inevitable trend of Hollywood's film distribution model in the future. Buffett and the other two looked at each other and turned to the next page again. What I'm going to explain next is why 2D animation can't be released in a comprehensive way. Eric glanced at Tom Murphy and said, "We have just reached a tacit understanding that The Lion King is just an event movie. From the box office trends of The Little Mermaid, Roger Rabbit, Beauty and the Beast, and Aladdin, we have not found any expansion in the 2D animation market, so I hope that everyone can temporarily ignore The Lion King, okay?" Tom Murphy nodded awkwardly. Warren Buffett and David West had already looked at the document in their hands. Eric continued, "In front of you is a comparison table of the weekly box office of 4 animated films. We can find that the weekly box office of 2 2D films is very unstable. Even after 8 weeks, there are fluctuations in the box office. Sometimes the box office has slipped to more than $5 million, but the next week, it suddenly rose to more than $8 million. The other 2 films have a similar stable box office curve. The answer to why this happens is on the next page." After the 4 of them turned the page at the same time, Eric looked up at the 3 of them and smiled. "Is it the amazing long bar in the first columnar scale chart that attracted your attention?" After Eric's reminder, even if they did not notice it at first, the 3 of them now saw the abrupt long bar in the first columnar scale chart. The histogram in front of you lists the proportion of audiences of different age groups for 2D animation films and 3D animation films. In order to show the results more directly, I divided the audiences into 4 age groups: 0 to 13 years old, 14 to 18 years old, 19 to 28 years old, and greater than 28 years old. These data are from Disney's past market research reports, so there is no doubt about its accuracy. Eric briefly explained, "We can clearly see that in 2D animation films, the proportion of audiences aged 0 to 13 years old is an astonishing 41% of the total audience, while for 3D animation films, this proportion is only 26%. However, this does not mean that the number of children who like 3D animation has decreased, but it is because the number of audiences above 13 years old has greatly increased. In the histogram, the proportion of audiences aged 14 to 18 years old and those aged 0 to 13 years old is a strong contrast, 17% and 29% respectively. For the 19 to 28 years old age group, the contrast is equally obvious, 7% and 16% respectively. I believe that in this age group, the 7% of audiences who watch 2D animation films are definitely there to bring their children along. As for the audiences above 28 years old who watch 2D animation films, I believe that most of them are there to satisfy their children's needs. After summarizing the data, Eric stopped looking at the document. He looked up and said, "Disney has always had the practice of re-releasing the previous 2D hand-drawn animated movies every 7 years. This is because Disney itself also focuses on children aged 7 to 13 as the main audience, and every 7 years, a new group of children will appear in the movie. Through these detailed statistics, it is not difficult to understand why the box office of 2D animation films is very unstable, and why they can only use the long-run model. Because the audience of 2D animation films is very young, and this part of the audience does not have the ability to act independently. They must be led by their parents to watch the film. Even during the summer vacation, adults still need to work. They often can only take their children to watch 2D animation films on weekends or some special holidays. In order to accommodate the very uncertain schedule of parents, the film company must use the long-run model that is about to be eliminated to fully exploit the box office potential of 2D animation. 3D animation films are different. This new model of animation films is not only loved by younger audiences, but also recognized by teenagers who have already formed their own purchasing power, as well as a part of the adult audience. In the statistics of the audience proportion just now, the proportion of children watching 3D animation films is only 26%, and the total proportion of the main audience of 14 to 28 years old is 45%. This proportion is almost the same as the audience of live-action films. This is also why 3D animation films can be distributed like live-action films. After Eric finished speaking, Buffett and the other two fell into a short silence. Eric did not disturb the three of them. He raised his hand and looked at his watch. Unknowingly, 15 minutes had passed. He did not want the waiter to barge in, so he turned his head and whispered a few words to Kelly Haynes. Although Kelly Haynes was a little reluctant to leave Eric's high-spirited speech, she still obediently took the initiative to stand up and walk out. When she walked to the door, Kelly Haynes realized that Eric was almost at her ear just now. Perhaps he could have kissed her cheek if he had moved a little closer, but she did not feel the slightest bit of resistance. Instead, she felt Eric's breath caressing her earlobe inexplicably hot. Hearing the soft sound of the door closing behind him, Eric looked at the three people who came back to their senses and smiled. "So, shall we continue?" Buffett and the other two nodded, although they still had a lot of questions in their hearts. Looking at the remaining half of the information in their hands, the three of them subconsciously felt that the young man in front of them must have considered all the questions that they might ask. Tom Murphy and David West were almost convinced by Eric at this time, and Buffett looked at Eric with deep admiration and enthusiasm. He was already 65 years old this year. Although he was still energetic, the problem of death had begun to plague him and the other partners of the company. Many of Berkshire Hathaway's partners had asked him more than once about the next successor of the company, and Buffett's children obviously did not have the ability to take on this position. Although Buffett believed that he could work for at least another 10 years, and once joked that he would appear to manage Berkshire Hathaway even after his death, everyone, including himself, knew very well that once he passed away, Berkshire Hathaway would definitely usher in an unforeseen great change. Buffett had also tried to groom a successor more than once, but his efforts had ended in failure several times. And now, the young man in front of him was able to calmly observe the development trend of the industry despite the popularity of The Lion King at the box office, and choose a long-term plan instead of being greedy for short-term benefits. His keen insight and firm execution had always been the prerequisites for his ideal successor. But Buffett soon felt a strong sense of regret. Eric's current wealth and status meant that he was unlikely to be the next leader of Berkshire Hathaway, because Buffett hoped that his successor could focus on the management of Berkshire Hathaway and not be distracted by other things. However, Eric's business was much larger than Berkshire Hathaway's. Even if he handed Berkshire Hathaway over to him, it would be difficult for Eric to spare too much energy to manage this equally large company. Although Buffett confirmed this with regret, he still felt a little unreconciled. Eric did not know what Buffett was thinking. Seeing that the three of them had no objections, he said, "So now that we've finished talking about the external factors that affect 2D animation, let's talk about the internal factors. I think everyone must have realized the difference in cost between the two movies." That's right, the two 2D animated movies listed here cost less than $30 million, but the cost of Toy Story and Bug Crisis cost $50 million and $80 million respectively. Eric paused and said, "First of all, I want to explain a problem. Whether it's 2D or 3D animation, the main cost is the cost of human resources. Every frame of the two animated movies is manually drawn, but the drawing medium is different. Because hand-drawn animation had been developed for more than half a century, the entire industry was very mature, and there were many animators. Therefore, even among the best hand-drawn animators in the world at Disney Animation Studio, There were very few who had an annual salary of more than $100,000. However, digital animators are a new profession, and there is a shortage of talent. Therefore, after the success of Toy Story, in order to prevent Pixar's skilled digital animators from being poached by other film companies, Firefly had to increase their salary. Similarly, after The Lion King, if Disney continues to maintain the hand-drawn animation department, this batch of animators, who originally had an annual salary of $50,000, may have a monthly salary of more than $10,000. In other words, the production cost of 2D animation will double. When Tom Murphy heard this, he suddenly interrupted Eric with a smile and said, "Eric, you just said that The Lion King is an event movie." "Of course, but what I think doesn't mean that everyone in Hollywood thinks the same. Don't they all think that the golden age of 2D animation has arrived?" Eric knew that Tom Murphy was just joking, so he explained and continued, "The production cost of The Lion King has already exceeded $45 million. If it doubles, the cost of 2D hand-drawn animation in the future may exceed $100 million. Eric clearly remembered that in 1999 in the original Spacetime, when he accidentally saw the latest 2D hand-drawn animation by Disney publicity company, Tarzan of the Apes, on the internet, it was advertised as the most expensive animated film in history. The production cost of Tarzan of the Apes was already $150 million, but the film's North American box office was only $170 million. According to Eric's accumulated experience, the cost plus the huge distribution fee, even if the subsequent peripheral profits of this live-action animation were calculated, the possibility of Disney making a loss was very high. Then, if in the next few years, the cinema companies are no longer willing to waste screen resources to continue the long-term distribution of 2D animated films, the cost of up to $100 million, and the publicity investment may rise to $50 million on average, we can almost be sure that unless there is a continuation of an event movie like The Lion King, it will be difficult for the company to recover the cost of the film through the box office. Then you will definitely say that the peripheral income of animated films has always been very rich. Then let's continue to look at the next statistics. Buffett and the other two were inexplicably amused by Eric's last sentence. They all laughed and continued to turn the page. At the same time, Kelly Haynes, who had just left, silently returned to Eric's side. Chapter 627. Eric glanced at the female assistant, and after receiving the look in her eyes, he continued, "The income of animation is mainly divided into toy production, image licensing, theme parks, original sound discs, stage plays, and so on. Because of the innate advantage of 3D animation, 3D animation is far more popular than 2D animation in terms of the types of toys that can be developed and the popularity of it. You can see this from the table in your hand. For example, Toy Story. This 3D animation has more than 100 types of toys and more than 300 image licensing. Beauty and the Beast and Aladdin only have a total of more than 60 types of toys. At the same time, the sales are far less than 3D animation, and the number of image licensing is also less than 3D animation. As for other types of entertainment, according to this data, the income of 3D animation is basically higher than that of 2D animation. And the only thing that 2D animation is ahead of 3D animation is the box office of the stage play adapted from animation. This is mainly because the live-action story of 2D animation is easier to adapt. However, this part of the income is insignificant compared to all the other entertainment. In the end, Eric concluded, so, in the case of no advantage in terms of cost, box office and entertainment, I can't think of a reason to continue to maintain the 2D animation department. Noticing the three old guys nodding at the same time, Eric smiled slightly, but he didn't intend to stop. He turned to a new page and said, then next is the difference in the production cycle of the two types of animated films. Ignoring the obvious bitter smile on the faces of the three, Eric continued, in the Disney era, Michael Eisner took charge of Disney in 1984 and adjusted the animation department until the release of the first successful, The Little Mermaid. It took a total of 5 years, and the subsequent animated films such as Beauty and the Beast, and Aladdin basically started during the years that Michael Eisner took charge. I've done some simple statistics. The average production cycle of hand-drawn animated films is 5 years, because hand-drawn animation has a very big disadvantage compared to computer animation. After computer animation is modeled in 3D, many of the materials can be used repeatedly, which saves a lot of labor and time costs. Therefore, Pixar only took 2 years to produce Toy Story and Bug. Every frame of hand-drawn animation must be drawn by the animator himself. In addition, to ensure that there is not too much useless work in the production process, before a hand-drawn animation project is launched, a long project incubation period is needed to confirm every detail of the animated film. This will seriously delay the production process of a hand-drawn animation. Noticing that David West's mouth twitched, Eric smiled and said, "David, I'm sure you want to ask, why not hire more people?" "Okay." David West spread his hands helplessly and cooperatively imitated Eric's tone. "Why not hire more people?" The other people in the private room chuckled. Eric also smiled and explained, "This brings us back to the topic I just mentioned. After 3D animation is modeled in computer, the image of the animated characters is fixed. Therefore, there can be many animators in charge of a project. Of course, this number can't be expanded indefinitely. But hand-drawn animation is different because different animators have their own drawing style. The number of animators in a project is limited to a certain range, and the style of the entire animation can be maintained. But if there are too many people in a project, unless the producer and director have super strong coordination skills, the audience is likely to find that the style of the movie and even the image of the characters are different. I think no matter who it is, if they encounter such a situation during the movie, they will be in a very bad mood, right?" After Buffett and the other two were forced to nod again, Eric said, "Actually, a long production cycle is not a big deal. As long as it can bring in excellent works and rich profits, I don't think time is a problem. But here's the problem. Compared to 3D animation, 2D animation not only has a long production cycle, but also has another very important disadvantage. Do you know what it is?" Buffett smiled and shook his head, while David West and Tom Murphy unceremoniously flipped to another page of the document. Kelly Haynes, who was sitting next to Eric, obviously knew the answer, but she didn't intend to answer Eric's question. She just smiled and looked at the young boss next to her. Unknowingly, she even supported her chin with her hand, with an unknown admiration in her eyes. Eric waited for the other three to turn to the next document before he continued. "Everyone knows that Hollywood sequels are often the most stable and profitable. But whether it is The Little Mermaid, Aladdin, or Beauty and the Beast, these hand-drawn animation films have not been released publicly. Instead, they plan to release them directly on videotape. The main reason for this is that the production cycle of 2D hand-drawn animation films is too long. If there is a conflict over the script of the sequels, it may exceed the average 5 years to 6, 7 years, or even longer. As I just said, the younger audience of 2D animation films changes every 7 years. Perhaps by the time the sequels of these films are completed, the children who originally accounted for more than 40% of the audience will have grown into teenagers who are no longer interested in 2D animation. The sequels won't have much popularity among the new younger audience. Therefore, after a popular hand-drawn animation, Disney's consistent strategy is to directly produce a sequel for videotape release. This kind of work is aimed at the small screen, and the requirements for the plot and the quality of the animation are not high. This has the advantage of rapid production and low cost. The film version of Aladdin costs more than $20 million, and the production cycle is 4.5 years. The direct videotape sequel cost only $5 million, and the production process only took 2 years. Although it makes a huge profit, this kind of shoddy videotape work is actually a kind of excessive consumption of the Disney brand. In this regard, 3D animation films have an absolute advantage in terms of the age distribution of the audience and the production cycle. As long as 3D animation works are popular enough, not only can they produce sequels in 2 to 3 years, but even after 7 years or even longer, because of the popularity of all age groups, the sequels can still be launched. At this point, The three old men didn't want to continue reading the documents. Buffett took the lead and said, "Eric, if you want, I can publicly support your decision in the newspaper tomorrow. I think Tom and David wouldn't mind doing this. However, I have one last question. You can choose not to answer, but I won't change my decision." Eric nodded. Buffett asked, "With Firefly's current strength, it won't be a big problem to continue to maintain Disney's hand-drawn animation department for a few years, and I think that in the short term, this department will still bring in enough profits for Disney. In the case of The Lion King's box office, why do you insist on such drastic measures?" Eric replied, "This reminds me of a short story in an article that introduced your life experience." Buffett smiled and motioned for Eric to continue. Tom Murphy and the other two also looked curious. Eric said, "I remember that the article introduced Berkshire Hathaway Textile Factory. In 1985, Hathaway Textile Factory was completely closed, and all the equipment in the factory was almost sold at the price of scrap metal. It was only $160,000. The article specifically mentioned that in 1981, Hathaway Textile Factory replaced 200 pieces of textile equipment with a unit price of $5,000. Only 4 years later, the average price of this batch of equipment was only $16. If you chose to close the profitable textile business in 1981, not only could you avoid the loss of millions of US dollars, but you could also bring in millions of US dollars of additional income by selling the textile business. However, only 4 years later, the value of all this had fallen to $160,000 US. Buffett didn't refute. He nodded frankly and said, "This was indeed a personal mistake on my part. At that time, the manager of Hathaway Textile Factory, Ken Zeiss, kept persuading me to sell the textile business, but I didn't do so." Eric brought the topic back to Buffett's question and said, "In fact, the measures I took were not drastic. 2 years ago, I had already revealed that I wanted to fully convert the animation department to 3D production, but most people didn't seem to take it seriously. They probably thought that hand-drawn animation was indispensable for Disney. Half a year ago, I officially announced the detailed reform plan to Disney's animation department, but it still didn't attract enough attention, and now," Eric spread his hands and said, "perhaps even the members of Disney's animation department who originally supported the digital reform must have changed their minds. There are more than 700 animators in Disney's hand-drawn animation department, and more than 1,000 employees in other support departments. Whether it's due to social influence or labor law restrictions, I never thought of letting these people lose their jobs. I gave them enough time to change, but they didn't cherish it. This is a good opportunity. With the influence of The Lion King, even if they leave Disney, I don't think they will be at risk of losing their jobs. So this is the best time to get rid of the burden. Maybe Firefly can even get some extra income from this. In the future, when 2D animation films decline, it will no longer be Firefly who needs to worry about the livelihood of these people." After listening to Eric's words carefully, Buffett asked, "You mean you plan to sell the entire hand-drawn animation department of Disney?" "The first choice in my heart is still to let the hand-drawn animation department undergo a digital transformation. Disney's hand-drawn animation department has very excellent production and directing talents. If they can successfully transition to 3D animation production, Disney won't have to train them again," Eric said, then shook his head with some regret and said, "But now, it seems that this possibility is very low. If the two sides can't reach an agreement in the end, I will package the entire hand-drawn animation department and sell it." "This plan doesn't seem to work," Tom Murphy said. "The most important thing in the animation department is the hand-drawn animators, not valuable assets such as real estate, patents, or copyrights. If they can't reach an agreement in the end, I think they won't let themselves be sold as bargaining chips." "It's nothing more than interests," Eric said. "As long as they agree, Firefly can return a part of the funds from the sale of the animation department to them as compensation. Moreover, I think the buyer will definitely want to get a complete animation production department. Firefly can also sell part of the 2D animation film rights to increase the success rate of the transaction. At the same time, the employees of the animation department can also get a higher salary from the buyer. Then the interests of the three sides are completely aligned. I can't think of any reason for them to refuse. David West couldn't help but say, Eric, I really want to know, what else have you not considered? Just as Eric was about to answer, Buffett said, there is also the long-term bonds that are being issued. Eric, before I came, I checked the bond issuance situation. Morgan Stanley and Deutsche Bank have sold a total of $4.9 billion of Firefly long-term bonds, and there is still $3.1 billion left. If you insist on closing the hand-drawn animation department, it will definitely have an impact on Firefly's current bond issuance. Have you considered that? Of course. Eric nodded and said, at present, Firefly has already divested the paper assets that are to be sold and the hand-drawn animation department that is very likely to be sold. This will at least bring in $2 billion of free cash flow for Firefly. This money is enough to make up for any possible impact caused by the unfavorable bond issuance. Moreover, I believe that after Firefly releases the financial report for the first half of the year in July, the possibility of bond sales being blocked is almost zero. As long as the investors aren't stupid, they can see that a hand-drawn animation department won't have much impact on Firefly's profitability. Then, I don't have any questions here. Buffett finally said, Eric, if you need our help with this matter, just let us know. Eric knocked on a few documents on the table and said, regarding the contents of this document, I hope that everyone can keep it confidential. Once it is leaked, the potential buyers will definitely change their minds. Buffett had already recorded the entire document in his mind with his extraordinary memory. He originally wanted to keep the document and savor it. But since Eric said so, in order to show his sincerity, Buffett picked up the document and handed it over. He smiled and said, in that case, maybe it's safer for you to take this document back. Tom Murphy and David West also handed the document back to Eric. Eric did not refuse. He put away the documents and said, also regarding this matter, as long as everyone can cooperate and help persuade the other shareholders to remain silent, then wait for the final result. Buffett said, no problem, I will make a few calls after dinner. Tom Murphy and David West gave the same promise. The three of them represented the interests of some of the original ABC shareholders. As long as they came forward to lobby, there would be no more trouble within Firefly. After the disagreement was resolved, the dinner that followed was very pleasant. Buffett and the other two were all elites in the business world for decades. Although Eric looked too young in the eyes of these people, his complete memory of his previous life also allowed him to talk to the three old men on any topic. This also made Buffett and the other two look at him in a new light. It was already 11 o'clock at night when dinner ended. Because it was a civilian-level restaurant, the total cost of the 5 people was only $220. This time, the invitation was issued by Buffett. There was no scramble to pay the bill that Eric often saw in his memory. It was just that when Buffett seriously calculated the full $33 tip and gave it to the waiter who had been looking forward to it all night, except for Tom Murphy, Buffett's old friend for many years who turned a blind eye, Eric, David West, and even Kelly Haynes all had the urge to pretend to be passers-by. Until Buffett and the other two left in the car, Eric could still feel that the female assistant beside him was suppressing some impulsive emotions with a straight face. Eric no longer hid the smile that he had been holding back and said to Kelly, "Are you calculating the psychological trauma of that waiter?" When Kelly Haynes heard the completely unfamiliar phrase psychological trauma, she was stunned for a moment, but she quickly realized the humor and ridicule in it. The suppressed smile instantly bloomed and she said, "I think after this, that waiter will definitely not have any expectations for a billionaire anymore." As they chatted casually, the two of them walked to the parking lot beside them. The driver was already waiting for them there. The Italian restaurant they were eating in just happened to share the parking lot with a movie theater nearby. Coincidentally, a movie had just ended, so the audience crowded out of the theater and rushed toward Eric and Kelly. Because it was already late at night, there were very few adults and children. Most of the people who walked out were teenagers who had a rich nightlife. Of course, there were many couples among them. In order to avoid being recognized, Eric took out his sunglasses and put them on. He noticed that the female assistant beside him was looking at a couple who were almost glued to each other. He joked, "I also have a free arm for rent. It's free." Kelly Haynes felt her heart skip a beat, but she forced herself to calm down and glanced at Eric. "Boss, you're really harassing me." Eric thought that Kelly Haynes was angry and was about to apologize when the two of them bumped into the crowd. When they bumped into each other, Kelly Haynes subconsciously reached out and grabbed the arm of the man beside her. Then, the two of them could not help but stop in their tracks. Eric looked at the female assistant who was looking down in confusion. Although the sunglasses affected his vision, he still noticed that the woman's originally white face was stained with a layer of red. After the crowd met with Eric and Kelly, they quickly turned to the parking lot beside them. Seeing that the woman had no intention of letting go of him, Eric tried to reach out and put his arm around her waist and followed the crowd to the parking lot. When Carter Moan saw the two of them walking over, he quietly opened the car door and ignored them. He was indeed used to it. However, Kelly Haynes was so embarrassed that she almost wanted to run away. A series of thoughts quickly floated through her mind. What's wrong with me? I definitely didn't do it on purpose. I'm 10 years older than him. What will he think? It seems like he's always liked mature people. Pooey, what am I thinking? I'm too shameless. This is my boss. Will he think that I'm very casual? No, I have to let go of him. But he's hugging me. How can I let go? It's over. I'm definitely going to lose this job. Eric gently let the woman into the car and got in as well. Carter Moan got into the car and similarly waited quietly for his boss's instructions. Based on his experience, they should not be returning to the Sharp Corner Manor. After a few minutes of silence, Eric glanced at the female assistant who was a little distracted. He thought of the cinema just now and probed, "Why don't we go watch a midnight movie together?" Kelly Haynes finally came to her senses. She quickly shook her head and said, "It's already very late. I still have to go to work tomorrow." Eric tried to make a joke to ease the atmosphere and said, "Don't forget that your boss is just beside you." "But Mr. Katzenberg isn't that easy to talk to. If I'm late for the regular meeting tomorrow morning, he'll definitely fly into a rage." Eric would not interfere with the authority of the management over such trivial matters. He said, "Then, I'll send you back. Where's your house?" When Kelly Haynes heard this question, she panicked again, but she still told him her address. Eric gestured to Carter Moan, and the car quickly started. 40 minutes later, the limousine stopped outside a villa in the wealthy district in the north of Santa Monica. Because of the awkward contact just now, the two of them did not speak much along the way. After Kelly Haynes got out of the car, Eric also got out of the car out of courtesy. "Then see you tomorrow," Eric said, feeling that the atmosphere was still a little strange. He subconsciously wanted to put his hands in his pockets, but he was wearing a suit now and not casual clothes. It would look very strange if he did so he did not move. Kelly Haynes hummed in a low voice. She still did not dare to look Eric in the eyes. "Good night, boss." Eric could feel that the woman was carefully using this more formal address to draw a line between them. He echoed, "Good night, Miss Haynes." The female assistant had just subconsciously wanted to use the address boss to remind herself and Eric, but when she heard Eric's similarly distant address, she felt uneasy. She hesitated for a moment and said, Why don't you come in and have a cup of coffee?" Eric had always felt that he was a person who was protective of women. When he felt the woman in front of him worrying about personal gains and losses, he felt a wave of irritation and suddenly lost his patience. He turned around and knocked on the window beside him. When Carter Moan lowered the glass window, he said, "I'm going to Kelly's place for a cup of coffee. You can pick me up tomorrow morning." Mr. Bodyguard was straightforward. He nodded and started the car to drive away. Kelly Haynes stared at everything that had suddenly happened in front of her, and her face turned red again. She said, I didn't mean anything else. I really just wanted to treat you to a cup of coffee." Towards the end, the female assistant's voice was already inaudible. She also realized that it was almost 12. Why the hell was he drinking coffee? Eric rudely pulled the charming woman in front of him into his arms. Under the woman's weak resistance, he said, "I didn't mean anything else." It's been a long time since I ran a marathon. I just happened to have a cup of coffee to refresh myself before running back to Malibu. I'll definitely be home before dawn." Kelly Haynes burst out laughing, and the last trace of hesitation disappeared inexplicably. She said softly, "You're really a rascal." With that said, the woman didn't resist anymore. They walked into the villa together. Before the lights could be turned on, the two figures were already stuck together in the darkness. The maid kissed for a long time. Feeling Eric's increasingly wanton actions, the female assistant was about to say something when a somewhat puzzled voice sounded in advance. "Madam Haynes, is that you?" Kelly Haynes bounced away from Eric as if she had been electrocuted. She replied with a trembling voice, "Jenny, it's me. You can continue sleeping." The voice paused for a moment before quickly replying, "Okay, Madam Haynes." After listening for a while, and making sure that the other party had no intention of walking out of the room, Kelly was relieved. She felt Eric pestering her again. She quickly pushed the man away and whispered, "I'm going to check on Nina." Eric grunted in acknowledgement. Sensing that the woman in the faint light was walking toward a room at the side, he subconsciously followed her. When they reached the door, Kelly Haynes realized that Eric was behind her. Thinking of what was going to happen next, the woman couldn't help but feel shy. She said angrily, You're not allowed to follow me in." Eric knew that Kelly was going to her daughter's bedroom, so he stopped in his tracks. A few minutes later, the female assistant walked out again shyly. Eric couldn't hold it in any longer. He picked the woman up a little roughly and asked with a hoarse voice, "Where's the bedroom?" The woman's body trembled slightly as she pointed in a direction. The two figures quickly disappeared into a room. What they didn't know was that in the nanny's room, another woman named Jennifer was standing behind the door that was slightly ajar. Her eyes were wide open, and she covered her mouth with one hand. She stood there in a daze for a few minutes, and after that, she couldn't sleep for the entire night. Thinking of the Hollywood big shot she recognized because of her curiosity, messy thoughts ran through her mind the entire night. To be continued. If you like this work, you're welcome to Chidian to be continued. If you like this work, you're welcome to Chidian to be continued. You're welcome to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Mobile users, please go to M to read. Chapter 628. In a villa in Santa Monica, the little girl named Nina got up early in the morning with the help of her nanny, Jennifer. She couldn't wait to run to the kitchen. "Good morning, Mom." The little girl greeted her mother and went to her side. Kelly Haynes, who was busy in front of the kitchen counter, bent over and kissed her daughter's cheek. "Good morning, baby." Jennifer went forward to help. She seemed to be casually sizing up the mistress whose cheeks were still rosy from joy. She said in a natural tone, "Madam Haynes, you look so good today." Kelly Haynes knew that since the nanny had woken up last night, she wouldn't be able to hide the fact that she brought Eric back. However, after everything that had happened last night, Kelly Haynes no longer had her initial apprehension and shyness. She was an adult single woman, and there was nothing shameful about bringing her lover home for the night. Hence, she only nodded slightly at the nanny and said, "Thank you, Jenny." However, this matter obviously didn't end so easily. Kelly was about to put the breakfast on the plate when her daughter pulled her collar with a mysterious expression and whispered, "Mom, I think I heard a cat meowing last night." When Kelly heard this, the frying pan in her hand almost dropped. Jennifer, who had been thinking about something, instantly turned her head and covered her mouth to suppress the laughter that almost overflowed out. Kelly took a deep breath and said to her daughter with a smile, "Baby, you must have heard wrongly." "Definitely not." Nina shook her little head with certainty. However, the girl didn't have the intention to argue with her mother. She said, "Mom, can we raise a kitten?" "Baby, we can't do that now. Mom has to work, you have to learn how to draw, and you have to go to school after the summer vacation. Even Jenny has her own things to do. If we raise a kitten and we can't find anyone to take care of it, we can only leave it alone at home." The kind-hearted little girl imagined the scene described by her mother in her mind, and shook her head in disappointment. "Then forget it. Kelly divided the breakfast into 4 portions and placed 3 of them on the table. She said to her daughter, "Hurry up and eat. After breakfast, Jenny will send you to class." The little girl nodded obediently, but unexpectedly pointed at another breakfast on the kitchen counter and said, "Mommy, why is there an extra breakfast?" Calmly, Kelly quickly found an excuse. "Mom plans to bring it to the company to make lunch." Jennifer noticed her mistress's panic and the little girl's confused expression. She suddenly realized that this was an opportunity and said, "Nina, yesterday you said that you drew a very beautiful painting in class. Why don't you show it to me?" The little girl's eyes lit up, and she instantly forgot about the previous topic. She couldn't wait to jump off the chair and run to her room. Kelly heaved a sigh of relief and said to Jennifer, "Thank you, Jenny." Jennifer tried her best to make her smile more sincere. She pointed at the leftover breakfast and asked, "Miss Haynes, do you need me to send it over?" Although Kelly enjoyed the joy of being with Eric, she also knew that she was destined to have no future with this little man. Because she was worried about her daughter's reaction, after Kelly got up, she begged Eric to wait for Nina to go to class before leaving. Eric also very considerately agreed. Thinking of the craziness last night, Kelly blushed and realized that Eric was definitely hungry now. Hearing Jennifer's suggestion, she hesitated for a moment before nodding and agreeing. Seeing that Kelly agreed, Jennifer got up and walked to the kitchen counter. She picked up the breakfast and walked out calmly. Although this half-renter, half-nanny girl was introduced by a good friend, Kelly had done a detailed research on her. Like many young people who appeared in Los Angeles, Jennifer was also a Hollywood wanderer with dreams of becoming a star. However, compared to those young people who were blindly seeking success, Jennifer appeared to be much more mature. This 22-year-old girl had just graduated from Denison University a few months ago. She had a good education and upbringing. After coming to Hollywood, she also took acting classes and acted in stage plays while waiting for opportunities. At the same time, she also found her current job as a nanny to make ends meet. If it were not for these reasons, Kelly would definitely not allow a Hollywood wanderer to be her daughter's nanny. Since she was able to become Eric's assistant, Kelly was, of course, the elite of the elite. She might not have realized something because she had been focusing on her daughter earlier, but now, she only noticed that Jennifer's body was a little stiff after picking up Eric's breakfast. She immediately understood a lot of things. However, Jennifer had not made any mistakes in taking care of Nina for a few months. Kelly had a good impression of this girl. If she could help her, Kelly would not be stingy. Thinking of this, Kelly called out to the girl, "Jenny." Jennifer paused. She was also a smart woman. She realized that her mistress might have guessed something. Her whole body was completely stiff. It took her a lot of effort to turn her head. Her eyes were flustered, and she forced a smile. "Miss Haynes." Kelly smiled encouragingly and said, "This is indeed a good opportunity. However, if you want to seize it, you'd better relax a little." Jennifer's suspended heart seemed to have landed on solid ground in an instant. She nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Miss Haynes." The unique fragrance in a woman's bedroom was always refreshing. Eric casually sat in front of the floor-to-ceiling window with his legs crossed. He leaned back in his chair and enjoyed the warm morning sun. His fingertips seemed to still have the touch of the female assistant's body. If it were not for the annoying news in the Los Angeles Times in front of him, the start of the day would have been perfect. Jennifer pushed the door open and came in. She was just in time to see the man in a white shirt leaning back in the leather chair leisurely. Before she could adjust her nervous heartstrings, the man had already turned around. However, Jennifer was conflicted about whether she should pretend to be surprised when she just recognized Eric. Therefore, she ignored the flash of surprise on Eric's face. The two looked at each other for a moment. Eric spoke first. "You're the housekeeper from last night?" Although Eric's tone was very casual, Jennifer still felt the natural sense of oppression from Eric's words and actions. "Yes." Jennifer nodded. However, she remembered that it would be terrible if he really thought of her as a housekeeper. So she quickly added in a messy tone, I'm just a part-time worker. Actually, my name is Jennifer Garner." Eric suddenly felt that this kind of inexplicable coincidence was always very interesting. so he could not help but laugh. However, this chuckle made Jennifer Garner think that she had messed up something. She became even more nervous. Eric quickly pointed to the food in the girl's hand. "This is my breakfast, right?" When Jennifer Garner heard Eric's question, she quickly nodded. "Yes, Mr. Williams." As she spoke, she handed the fine porcelain plate with fried eggs and sandwiches to Eric. Then, she realized that Eric was holding the plate and did not know where to start. She became embarrassed again. She glanced at the dressing table on her right, but Eric did not seem to have any intention of moving his body. Eric freed a hand and patted his right knee that was propped up on his left leg. "Can you help me put a few tissues on it?" Of course, no problem." Jennifer Garner nodded in a panic. She took the tissue box from the dressing table and came to Eric's side. The leather chair that Eric was sitting on was lowered to the lowest point. Jennifer Garner had a tall figure. The girl first bent her waist, but she immediately felt that this somewhat condescending posture would make Eric unhappy. So she squatted down. However, this posture seemed even more inelegant. After a slight hesitation, the girl knelt down beside Eric's leg like a docile maid. She carefully spread the tissues on Eric's knee. Eric silently watched Jennifer Garner's series of actions. He could not help but feel the oppressive power of wealth and power. However, this feeling was indeed very enjoyable. It also explained why there were always so many people in this world who worked their whole lives for fame and fortune. After she finished spreading the tissues, she saw that the plate was put down. Jennifer Garner looked up at Eric and noticed the change in the man's expression. She suddenly gave up the idea of getting up and quietly knelt beside Eric's leg. The girl even wondered if she should help Eric hold the plate so that he could eat more conveniently. However, Jennifer Garner still had some self-respect. Her current state had already reached her bottom line. Although this bottom line was so fragile that it could not withstand a single blow. But, unless Eric took the initiative to ask, she felt that she should still persevere. Right? Eric did not intend to let the girl continue to do anything. He divided the fried egg and sandwich on the plate into small pieces, picked up a fork, and put it into his mouth. At the same time, he did not neglect the girl beside him. He casually asked, "Since it's a part-time job, let me guess. Since you're so beautiful, you must want to enter Hollywood, right?" "Well," Jennifer Garner deliberated over her words and replied, "I envy that kind of life, so I want to give it a try." Eric nodded and said, "At least you didn't say that I've liked acting since I was young, and that I was determined to be an actor at the age of 8. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to eat breakfast properly." In fact, many stars in Hollywood usually don't think that they will embark on this path when they are young, but fate is often so magical. Inexplicably, some people find that they have become Hollywood superstars with a net worth of tens of millions overnight. For many things, the more you deliberately pursue them, the harder it is to get them. Jennifer Garner realized that she had made the right bet, and smiled in agreement. Jennifer Garner was a typical Western beauty with high cheekbones and thick lips, so she was obviously not Eric's cup of tea. However, since they had met, Eric did not mind giving her a few more pointers. He said, "Since you want to enter Hollywood, then do you know where your strengths and weaknesses are?" Jennifer Garner's thoughts were spinning, but she still could not answer Eric's question for a while. She had only been in Hollywood for a few months, so how could she understand these things? Eric did not expect the girl to answer. He said, "You are very beautiful, but in Hollywood, this is definitely not your strength. It can even be a disadvantage because beauty is something that Hollywood does not lack. If you often watch movies, you will find that in those movies with more party plots, you can always see countless vase beauties, and your figure and appearance happen to be the type that is very suitable to be a background vase. If you can't find your position, then a vase is likely to be your final destination." Jennifer Garner listened to Eric's pointers with rapt attention. She even wanted to take out a pen and paper to write it down on the spot. Now, even the top stars in Hollywood would not easily get Eric's pointers. The smart girl understood that this opportunity was definitely more precious to her than suddenly getting a female lead role from Eric, because today's words would definitely save her a lot of detours in her future acting career. Eric ate his breakfast leisurely and continued slowly. "Since beauty can't be your capital, Then what about other things? Acting skills, hee hee. This kind of thing is as abundant in Hollywood as beautiful women. If you want to enter Hollywood, you can't not have acting skills, but you absolutely can't use acting skills as your capital, especially a beautiful woman like you. Even if you have excellent acting skills, they are often covered by your appearance. Jennifer Garner felt that Eric had been talking about her shortcomings, but did not tell her where her strengths were. When his voice fell, she could not help but ask, "Mr. Williams, what should I do?" Eric smiled and looked at the girl who was still kneeling by his legs. He said, "You are very smart, which is an advantage. Too many people in Hollywood often fail because they are not smart enough. Even if they encounter an opportunity, they don't know how to seize it." Jennifer Garner smiled, lowered her head slightly and lowered her eyes. Eric continued to point out, "And now, another important factor to step into Hollywood, opportunity, is no longer a problem for you. However, if you can't find your own direction, then you can only become a second-tier actress at most, and as you grow older, even if you realize what path you should take, it will be difficult to compete with the new generation of actresses." Realizing that Eric was about to say the key point, Jennifer Garner raised her pretty face again. "Your beauty is neither sweet nor silly, but somewhat fierce, which means that you are absolutely not suitable for any silly and sweet female lead role. Then there is only one acting path that is most suitable for you, an action actress." Although it had only been a few months since she came to Hollywood, Jennifer Garner had been lucky enough to attend several auditions, but the results were no exception. When Eric said this, the girl suddenly realized why the roles she auditioned for did not come to fruition. "Mr. Williams, are you talking about an action actress like Miss Nicole Kidman?" Eric remembered that in the original Space-Time, Nicole's acting career had declined all the way after she won the Oscar. The main reason was that she could not find a suitable path for herself. Hearing the girl's question, Eric shook his head and said, "Nicole is not an action actress. Her acting path is much broader. But for you, the most suitable path is only this one. Persevere, then, before the age of 35, you may become the first female lead in Hollywood action movies." Speaking of this, Eric was actually thinking of Angelina Jolie at this time. In his opinion, Julie was neither beautiful nor sexy, and her figure was just average. But after the media's repeated brainwashing of "Julie is very beautiful, Julie is very sexy" thousands of times, even those who were very disgusted with Julie might have the idea that, oh, this woman is really not bad in their hearts. Moreover, Julie had been on the right path for her style since her debut. Because of this, in Hollywood, where other female stars were rising and falling, Julie had always been able to maintain her position as an A-list actress. Eric remembered that Julie had a very powerful agent. In the original Space-Time, Nicole could not withstand the continuous decline of her career, and later chose to leave the industry giants like CAA and seek refuge with Julie's agent. Jennifer Garner firmly remembered Eric's words in her heart, but still asked with some dissatisfaction, "Then, what about after the age of 35? Eric had already finished his breakfast. He looked at the expectant girl and smiled. "It's not good to be too greedy. After the age of 35, you must have earned enough money. Next, you should take care of your body, get married, have children, enjoy life, and maybe try to fight for an Oscar or something." In fact, after the age of 35, if the fame was still there, the next path was very simple. Play the villain. The Witch and Sleeping Beauty, Snow White's stepmother, and so on. Even Auntie May, who had failed the most but persevered in the Oscars, learned the bad things. Jennifer Garner was very smart and did not ask any more questions. She took the plate in front of Eric fawningly, but did not get up immediately. She looked like a little maid waiting for Eric's instructions. This kind of fawning action made Eric unable to help but reach out and lift the girl's chin. He looked at the face in her early 20s as if he was admiring a brand new work of art. He said, "Actually, I like the name Jennifer the most. It means a charming woman." Jennifer Garner's body trembled slightly as she felt the cool fingertips brush across her cheeks. She said softly, "Mr. Williams, I'll be staying at Ms. Haynes' place for a while. Okay, if I have time, I will call you. I hope you won't reject my date then." Eric smiled and said, "But now, you have to hurry down and take Nina away." Otherwise, Kelly and I will be late for work. Chapter 629. After breakfast, after sending her daughter and Jennifer Garner off, Kelly Haynes returned to the house. Eric had already come downstairs. His suit and tie were hanging on his arm, and he was holding a newspaper in his hand. Kelly walked forward and gently reached out to button Eric's shirt collar. She then helped the man with his tie and asked, "What were you talking about just now? What took you so long?" "A very smart girl. I just gave her a few pointers," Eric said as he leaned over and kissed the female assistant's lips. Kelly smiled and pushed Eric away. She continued to tie his tie. She thought of Jennifer Garner's blushing face when she came downstairs and said, "Jennifer is so lucky. I thought you did something else." Eric did not mention what had just happened. He said casually, "She's not my type. You must know that." Kelly tied his tie and checked it again. She smiled and asked, "Then what type do you like?" Eric smiled and reached out to hold the female assistant's soft waist. He said, "Of course, it's someone like you." Feeling that Eric seemed to want to push her to the sofa, Kelly blushed and hurriedly said, "Don't, Eric. It's already 8:05. I have to be at the company before 9. Although there was still nearly an hour before 9, Eric also knew that the roads in Los Angeles would be very crowded during work hours. If he did not leave early, he would be very likely to be late. After kissing the female assistant's cheek, Eric let go of her and handed the Los Angeles Times to her. He pointed to a piece of news and said, "Ronald Perlman's and Drew Holdings Group suddenly announced yesterday that it had bought $400 million of Firefly long-term bonds. I don't think this matter is that simple. It might be related to what happened recently. Bring this newspaper to Katzenberg. I want to see the relevant report this afternoon." When Kelly heard Eric talk about business, she showed a professional expression. She quickly skimmed through the short news article and nodded. "I'll pass it to Mr. Katzenberg as soon as possible." Eric then remembered that Chris had returned to New York from Boston. He had asked Chris to pay attention to news related to Marvel. Since it involved Ronald Perlman, the current actual controller of Marvel, he said, "Also, inform Chris to pay attention to this matter." Kelly nodded again and added, "Do we need to inform Mr. Buffett and the others?" "They must already know, but let's officially inform them. I'm sure Buffett and David West will be able to see some clues." After Kelly drove to Firefly's headquarters in Burbank, Eric also rushed to Firefly Studios in Praia Vista. Compared to Burbank, which was 20 kilometers away, Praia Vista was less than 10 kilometers away from Santa Monica, and the road conditions were much better than in the city. It only took Eric 20 minutes to reach the studio. Thinking of the request for a meeting between the head of the animation department, Peter Schneider, and Roy Disney yesterday, Eric decided to have a chat with the other party, so he did not go directly to Victoria's Secret studio in the studio. Instead, he went to his office in the administrative district. He turned on the computer to deal with a few emails. He inadvertently looked at the time and found that it was already 9:15. Eric frowned. Just as he was about to make a call to ask what was going on, there was a knock on the office door. Eric thought it was Peter Schneider and Roy Disney. Although they were 15 minutes late, Eric was not a harsh boss. Besides, the two sides were likely to part ways soon, so he said to the door in a normal tone, "Come in." The person who opened the door was his secretary in the studio. The secretary glanced at Eric's face and seemed to be cautious. She said, "Mr. Williams, I just received a call from Mr. Peter Schneider. He said that something urgent came up so he can't come." Eric shook his head and laughed. He didn't know if it was self-deprecating or something else. He said, "Since they want to cancel the meeting, why didn't they call in advance? Why did they have to wait until the time was over? Are they playing with me?" It was the first time the secretary had seen a subordinate stand her boss up in such a rude way. She had expected this young boss to be angry. When she heard Eric's question, she helplessly shrank her neck and said in a low voice, "Mr. Williams, I don't know." Eric suddenly lost interest in pursuing the matter. He waved at the secretary and said, "Forget it. Go back to work." The secretary quietly left the office like a cat. Eric read some emails patiently. Most of the irritation in his heart disappeared. He turned off the computer, left the administrative building, and went to Victoria's Secret studio in the studio area. As soon as he walked into the busy studio, Edward Razek, who was the deputy of the Victoria's Secret show project, and Todd Thomas, the chief designer of Victoria's Secret, came up to him. They said, "Eric, the British military suit that you personally designed has been completed. Do you want to see it?" Eric felt that Edward Razek's attitude today seemed to be a little eager, but he didn't care. He nodded. The three of them walked to a work area together. Eric saw the plastic model's angelic suit at first glance. It was a classic British military suit with a striking red color and stunning black wings on the back. This was the second outfit for the opening of the 2013 Victoria's Secret show. The model was Bahati Prince, nicknamed Little Pumpkin. As a veteran uniform lover, Eric's deepest impression of that year's Victoria's Secret show, other than the unlucky girl who stole the limelight and had no friends, was the angelic suit in the British military style. Moreover, Eric didn't choose the angelic suit for no reason. The theme provided by the Victoria's Secret design team happened to be in the British style. Since he had a ready-made template in his mind, Eric decisively decided on the theme and changed the name of the theme to a term that had just become popular in the rock world in recent years: British Invasion. However, other than the military style, Eric didn't take out other angelic suits to steal the design team's work. Anyway, the British elements were nothing more than gentlemen, football, umbrellas, and so on. Edward Razek and Todd Thomas were also very satisfied with the angelic suit that Eric took out. The three of them stood side by side and admired it for a while. Edward said, "Eric, why don't you get a model to try it on and see the effect?" "No need." Eric shook his head and said, "Call Miss Kruger and ask her to come over and try it on. I specially designed this angelic suit for her." Diane Kruger, who had just turned 18, had a youthful aura that was very similar to the little pumpkin in his memory. It was perfect for her to wear this angelic suit. Eric didn't plan to immediately launch a sky-high beret gimmick this year. Therefore, the angelic suit in front of him, whether it was stunning or the significance it represented in the British theme, could be used as the opening of the first Victoria's Secret show. The first batch of Victoria's Secret angels who had signed the contract had already started training. Diane Kruger was no exception. Hearing Eric's order, Todd Thomas took the initiative to walk away and call the other party. Edward Razek felt that Eric must be in a good mood at this time. So he said, "Eric, we still have one last spokesperson that hasn't been confirmed. Miss Heaver." Eric patted his head and said, "Oh, I've been too busy recently. I almost forgot about this. Claudia has a contract with another bra brand. I'm afraid she can't participate in the show. Do you have anyone to recommend?" Edward Razek thought to himself that even without this obstacle, Claudia Heaver would definitely not participate in the Victoria's Secret show now. However, he didn't express his thoughts. After a moment of hesitation, he said, "Eric, Miss Cindy Crawford contacted us yesterday. She said that she still hopes to participate in this year's Victoria's Secret fashion show and is willing to cooperate fully with the program schedule." "Didn't she already?" Eric said absent-mindedly. He suddenly turned his head to look at Edward Razek and smiled. "Did something happen?" Edward Razek realized that Eric really didn't know about this, so he explained, "Warner suddenly fired Miss Crawford and gave the female lead role of competitive game to Miss Heaver." Eric suddenly realized that Joe Silver must still be a little unhappy. He wanted to get Claudia to join the unlucky project to pull him into the game. However, Eric rarely asked the women what movies they would accept. Unless it was a special movie, the women wouldn't bother him with these things. Therefore, Joe Silver's plan was wrong from the beginning. If the project was the same as before, Claudia's popularity would definitely be affected if she accepted the contract. Originally, Cindy Crawford had completely cut off her path to Hollywood with this film. However, on second thought, even if the movie was a flop, with him around, Claudia would definitely not end up like Cindy Crawford. Therefore, Eric dismissed the idea of getting involved. Noticing that Edward Razek was beside him waiting for his reply, Eric realized that this deputy must have been asked to do something. He smiled and said, "If you think it's suitable, Then the last spokesperson spot will be given to Cindy Crawford. Cindy Crawford was the most popular supermodel in the public. A few years ago, she even had her own TV show. Victoria's Secret's debut show played the public card. Adding such a supermodel could increase the show's popularity. Eric didn't even give her a chance to speak at the celebration party for True Lies, mainly because this woman was a little greedy. She wanted to do both the movie and the show. It was impossible for her to leave the movie alone, so the rehearsal time for Victoria's Secret would definitely be squeezed. Eric attached the same importance to the show as he did to the movie. Of course, he wouldn't allow such a restless factor to exist. Edward originally thought that Eric would refuse. He didn't expect him to agree so easily. Instead, his expression was a little strange. "Edward, you don't think that I ruined her chance to be the female lead, do you?" Edward smiled and said, "A lot of people in the industry have thought so recently, but I don't think so anymore." Eric shrugged. "Although I don't know what exactly happened, Cindy Crawford seems to be the victim. I didn't expect Joe Silver to invite Claudia, but since my woman is the one who got the benefits, I'll take the blame." Eric was not bothered by Edward's words at all. Eric shrugged and said, "I don't know what happened, but Cindy Crawford seems to be the one who got caught in the crossfire." Edward felt that Eric's words were very interesting. He also smiled, but he didn't quite understand why the fish in the pond got involved, so he asked curiously. "Oh, it's very simple," Eric explained. "The city was on fire. The residents drained the water in the moat to put out the fire. Then the fish died of thirst." Edward Razek nodded and said, "This sounds like a fable, but I've never heard of it." "It's an Eastern fable. It's not surprising that you haven't heard of it." Edward Razek didn't continue to ask. He said, "Miss Crawford is still waiting for news. Do you want me to call her to come over and talk about the contract?" "Okay." Eric nodded casually and asked, "How's the music selection going?" "I've picked 5 songs for each theme. I'll get Sam to bring them to you." Cindy Crawford felt that her experience in the past few days was really terrible. In order to get back at her for rejecting the Victoria's Secret show, that hateful bastard not only ruined the movie role that she had spent months fighting for, but what was even more infuriating was that he even gave the role that originally belonged to her to his lover. If that was all, it would be fine. Because of the inexplicable news that Eric wanted to target her, not only did some of her contacts in Hollywood immediately stay away from her, but even several endorsement contracts that were in discussion were suddenly withdrawn by the businessmen. According to her agent, the other party was worried that Eric Williams would target her and cause her to be blacklisted. Although she was very smart, she didn't understand why Eric Williams wanted to blacklist her. Even if he now owned the largest media group in North America, it was impossible for him to affect all media, right? She asked her agent, but her agent couldn't tell her why. But she still suggested that if she wanted to continue her career, it was best to take the initiative to compromise with the other party. Bastard. Bitch. Looking at the huge studio outside the car window, Cindy Crawford cursed loudly in her heart. But after the driver opened the door, the woman, who was originally a little upset, recovered her charming and elegant posture in less than a second. After getting out of the car, she threw a charming smile at the stunned driver. Cindy Crawford had always enjoyed the look of those men falling head over heels for her. It was just that she didn't realize that if it weren't for the feeling of being in the limelight, she wouldn't have had to pay so much to maintain this halo. Her agent, Jeremy, got out of the passenger seat, and the two were about to walk to the studio when another car also stopped in front of the studio. Diane Kruger was originally training the tablecloth. When she heard Eric's call, she hurriedly changed out of her training clothes and rushed over. Because she didn't expect this, she only wore a t-shirt and jeans today. Therefore, when she got out of the car, she happened to meet Cindy Crawford, who was wearing a black low-cut dress and had a strong aura. She couldn't help but feel a little inferior. Cindy Crawford glanced at the young girl who had been personally picked by Eric. She sized her up, and a trace of jealousy flashed through her heart. However, she didn't bother to hide the mockery on her face. What a man with poor taste. With this thought in mind, she saw someone coming out of the studio. Cindy Crawford's expression immediately returned to normal, thinking that the other party was here to pick her up, so she smiled and greeted her. "Cindy, why are you here?" As the chief designer of Victoria's Secret, Todd Thomas of course knew Cindy Crawford. However, before the other party could reply, Todd Thomas hurriedly waved at Diane Kruger. "Miss Kruger, let's go in quickly. Mr. Williams has been waiting for you for a long time." Diane Kruger nodded and didn't greet Cindy Crawford. She hurriedly followed Todd Thomas into the studio. Cindy Crawford and her agent, Jeremy, who had been ignored, looked embarrassed at the same time. They looked at each other and didn't say anything. Just as they were about to enter the studio, they were once again stopped by the tall guard. In order to prevent information about the Victoria's Secret show from being leaked in advance, the guards at the studio were ordered to pack up and leave immediately if anyone sneaked into the studio without permission. Therefore, although they had seen Todd Thomas greet the girl, the two didn't take the initiative to show their passes. They hadn't been notified, so the guards didn't dare to risk losing their jobs by letting them in. After being slighted like this, Cindy Crawford felt the hatred in her heart soar once again, almost bursting out of her body. Her agent, Jeremy, seemed more mature. He took the initiative to explain, "Mr. Edward Razik invited us here." The guard nodded and said, "Sorry, sir, I have to ask first." Because it was just a studio, the guard's office didn't have an internal phone. The guard who had spoken said something to his partner and walked into the studio. After a few minutes, the guard came back again and waved his hand simply to let Cindy Crawford and her agent in. Cindy Crawford unconsciously clenched her fists, but she already had the urge to turn around and leave. Even that ugly duckling bitch had someone coming to pick her up, and she had come in person, but there wasn't even anyone to greet her. What was this? Jeremy didn't want Cindy Crawford to turn around and leave just because she was angry. If this employer was really banned, it would be difficult for him to find such a profitable supermodel client. This was related to his own income. Jeremy pulled the girl and whispered, "Cindy, let's go in." Cindy Crawford felt that the two guards must be mocking her, but Jeremy's words seemed to give her a way out. Cindy Crawford nodded and walked into the studio with a cold expression. Chapter 630. The new Studio 11 of Firefly Studios was 75 meters long and 45 meters wide, which was even more spacious than the largest studio on the Warner set. At this time, the studio was divided into 6 main work areas. A total of 120 people were responsible for the design of the 6 themes of the Victoria's Secret show. When Cindy Crawford walked into the studio with her agent, Jeremy, she saw a busy scene. However, there were a lot of people gathered in the innermost part of the studio. Some of the noisy music was coming from there. Jeremy pulled a staff member over and asked a few questions. Then they walked toward the group of people in the innermost part of the studio. As soon as they reached the periphery of the crowd, Cindy Crawford and Jeremy heard a slight noise at the same time. Then the music suddenly stopped. Cindy Crawford's pupils shrank as she looked in the direction of the crowd. A fiery red figure with black wings appeared in her sight. The girl in this stunning uniform was Diane Kruger, whom she had just met outside the studio. At this time, Diane Kruger seemed to be a completely different person from the young girl in the t-shirt and jeans. The red uniform symbolized passion, and the black wings represented mystery. When combined perfectly with the pure and sweet face, it suddenly gave people a feeling of invincibility and vitality. Cindy Crawford had always been very proud, but she couldn't help but feel a little jealous at this time. Maybe this set of clothes should have belonged to her. These thoughts were still lingering in her mind when Cindy Crawford heard the voice that she had hated for several days. "Diane, come here." Eric waved to the girl who was a little shy from being stared at by dozens of people at the door of the changing room. Diane Kruger heard Eric's voice and hurried to him. Realizing that everyone's eyes were focused on Diane Kruger, Cindy Crawford, who was ignored by the crowd, reluctantly walked to Eric and took the initiative to say, "Mr. Williams, nice to meet you again." Eric was just about to discuss with Todd Thomas the details that needed to be improved on Diane Kruger's angel outfit when he heard another woman's voice. He turned his head and realized that it was Cindy Crawford. This time he didn't deliberately snub the lady as he took the initiative to extend his hand and said with a smile, "That's right. It's nice to see you again, Miss Crawford." Cindy Crawford was reminded of the time when Eric deliberately didn't shake her hand at the party. Seeing him reach out his hand, she suddenly had an impulse to embarrass this despicable guy in the same way. However, before this thought could take form, Cindy Crawford realized that her right hand had already reached out to him. Eric shook Cindy Crawford's hand and said, "Miss Crawford, we'll talk about your matter later. Please wait a moment." This affirmative tone made Cindy Crawford speechless for a moment. However, Eric ignored her and turned to Diane Kruger on the other side. With Eric's change, the others who had noticed Cindy Crawford's arrival changed their focus again. Only Edward Lazek, who had a good relationship with her, nodded at her. Eric made Diane Kruger do a few poses and twirl a few times. He discussed a few flaws that needed to be fixed with Todd Thomas, and then said to Diane Kruger, "Try walking according to the music you just heard and see how it goes." Diane Kruger of course had no objection. Eric ordered the crowd to clear a path of more than 10 meters. When Diane Kruger was ready, Eric pressed the play button of a rock song. Diane Kruger realized that the upcoming performance might be much more important than the interview. When she heard the music, she took a deep breath and raised her face slightly to reveal a confident smile. She grasped a certain rhythm and walked onto the temporary runway, with cat-like steps. However, the rhythm of the rock song did not seem to be suitable for the runway. Diane Kruger walked to the end and made a sexy pose. When she turned around and walked back, the rhythm of the music suddenly became hurried, which immediately disrupted the girl's pace. After returning to the starting point, Diane Kruger looked at Eric, who was not far away. The background music of the runway could not completely match the rhythm of the model's pace. Therefore, as long as a professional model could find the rhythm, the subsequent steps would not be affected by the sudden change of the rhythm of the music. This time, it was her personal mistake. Eric frowned slightly, but not because of this. He waved his hand and said to the girl, "Forget it. You don't have to walk." Diane Kruger came to Eric and pleaded in a weak voice, "Mr. Williams, I can do it again. This time, I won't make a mistake." "That's not the problem." Eric shook his head. He thought of something and looked back. Cindy Crawford, who was gloating, noticed that Eric turned around. She quickly put away the contemptuous expression at the corner of her mouth. Eric found Cindy Crawford and pointed to the runway in front of him. He asked, "Miss Crawford, are you free now?" Cindy Crawford certainly knew what Eric was referring to. She smiled confidently and said, "Of course." Eric said to Todd Thomas, "Todd, take her to change into a set of underwear." Cindy Crawford felt that the moment she had been waiting for had finally come. She followed Todd Thomas into the fitting room. The designer skillfully chose a set of black lace underwear for Cindy Crawford and handed it to her. He pointed to the cubicle next to him and said, "Cindy, you can change in there." Cindy Crawford took the underwear and looked at it. Although Todd Thomas had good taste and the underwear was very sexy, she was still a little dissatisfied. "Todd, is this all?" Todd Thomas was stunned. He smiled and explained, "Cindy, the angel outfit just now was specially designed for Miss Kruger. We have only completed one set so far. The rest are still in the process of being made." Cindy Crawford asked tentatively, "I can wear her outfit?" Todd Thomas had just left to call Diane Kruger, so he didn't hear the conversation between Edward and Eric. However, Cindy Crawford's appearance here made him guess something. Hence, Todd Thomas shook his head and persuaded, "Cindy, don't be stubborn. I've also heard some recent rumors. The most important thing for you now is to seize this opportunity. If you join this show, I believe that with your reputation and qualifications, you will definitely get your own angel outfit." In the past, the designers in the fashion industry treated her like a treasure. Even the top designers rarely spoke to her in such a tone. Therefore, Todd Thomas's words made Cindy Crawford's mood, which had just improved a little, turn sour again. Todd Thomas noticed the change in Cindy Crawford's expression. He did not want to offend this darling of the fashion industry. He pointed to the wardrobe and shoe rack next to him and said, "We can choose some accessories, but it's better to be quick." Cindy Crawford's expression softened a little. Both of them had a good taste for fashion. Although they did not have angel outfits, with the materials in the fitting room, they quickly matched an outfit. Eric waited for nearly 5 minutes. He was a little puzzled, and was about to ask someone to take a look when Cindy Crawford and Todd Thomas came out of the fitting room. Black lace underwear, white gauze shawls, eye-catching crystal bracelets, and strappy boots. These simple items perfectly set off a noble and charming temperament. Cindy Crawford noticed Eric's satisfied nod and the uneasy girl standing next to him. She immediately heaved a sigh of relief. "Can we start?" Eric pressed the tape recorder on the workbench and asked. Cindy Crawford made an okay gesture, and Eric pressed the play button. He then said to Diane Kruger beside him, "Watch carefully." The rock music started again. Cindy Crawford waited for a moment, and then stepped on the runway again. Unlike the immature Diane Kruger, Cindy Crawford finished the whole process in one go. She was not affected by the changes that had affected Diane Kruger at all. When Cindy Crawford returned to the starting point, Eric turned off the music and asked the girl next to him, "Did you see anything?" Diane Kruger said in a low voice, I'm not as good as Miss Crawford. She's been on the runway for 10 more years than you. Of course you're not as good as her." Eric smiled and shook his head. "Pay attention to Cindy's aura later." After saying that, Eric gestured to Cindy Crawford to do it again. Of course, Cindy Crawford didn't mind letting the lucky rookie see what a supermodel was. She nodded and the music started again. "Look." This time, Eric pointed at Cindy Crawford, who was doing the catwalk, and said to the girl next to him, "Calm, confident, and strong aura. It gives people the feeling that the entire stage and the audience's eyes belong to me. This is the real supermodel." Noticing that Cindy Crawford returned to the starting point again, Eric turned off the music and continued to say to Diane Kruger, "Although your outfit is stunning and eye-catching on the stage, you lack this kind of aura. You know what? I'm going to let you do the opening. I'm sure you know what this means. But what I want is for the audience to remember you, not the clothes you're wearing. Here, let me show you again." Eric said to Cindy Crawford, who was standing not far away, "Miss Crawford, take off your accessories and do it again." Cindy Crawford didn't understand why Eric did this, but Edward Lazek, who had been standing next to Eric, heard everything that Eric said to Diane Kruger. He realized that Eric didn't have any negative feelings towards Cindy Crawford. He even admired her. Noticing Cindy Crawford's hesitation, Edward Lazek also knew that Cindy Crawford was arrogant. He didn't want this friend of his to leave a bad impression on Eric, so he quickly winked at Cindy Crawford. Cindy Crawford noticed Edward Lazek's look and cleverly chose to do as she was told. She smiled and took off her shawl and wrist accessories. Seeing that Eric pointed at her boots, Cindy Crawford also quickly changed into the black high heels she wore when she came. "Okay, let's do it again." Eric waited for Cindy Crawford to tidy herself up before pressing the play button again. He watched Cindy Crawford walk the entire way with great satisfaction. Then he said to Diane Kruger, "Look, even if Cindy takes off all the accessories on her body, the powerful aura she exudes is still there. Also, her steps are very stylish, easily leaving a deep impression on people. Aura is something that you can only slowly figure out. Of course, I hope that you can form your own unique aura and not imitate others. That will only make you look neither fish nor fowl. You still have 4 months to do that. However, I'm also very dissatisfied with your walk. How many hours do you train every day?" Diane Kruger replied, "All kinds of training add up to a total of 6 hours. That won't do." Eric shook his head and looked at Edward Lazek beside him. "Get her a special training team. I want the best. In addition, increase the amount of training. 10 or 12 hours a day is fine. It has to be to the point where she's pushed to the limit without harming her body." After Edward Lazek nodded, Eric looked at the cowering girl beside him and said, "If you really can't figure out aura, then come out. In addition, the cost of hiring a training team can be deducted from your future endorsement fee." During this period of time, Eric had been very approachable and friendly with everyone in the team. He didn't have any of the aura of a boss at all. Therefore, many people were even used to occasionally joking with Eric. However, at this time, when they heard Eric's words, except for Diane Kruger, who was like a little lamb under the claws of a tiger, many people around them couldn't help but have the same thought. Tyrant. Even Cindy Crawford, who had unknowingly moved to Eric's side, put away all of her proud expression. A series of labels of Eric's identity quickly floated through everyone's minds. North America with a net worth of tens of billions and the richest man in the world, owner of the world's largest media group, Firefly, a Hollywood director who had created a series of box office miracles. Any one of these titles was enough to make people respect and even fear, but Eric had already obtained all of these before he was 25 years old. Moreover, his businesses showed no signs of stopping. This was no longer a person, but a mountain that could crush all the capital and pride that everyone else in the world relied on. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come and vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Mobile users, please read it at m. Chapter 631. Eric didn't feel the emotional changes of others. Instead, he recalled the history of the Victoria's Secret show in his memory. The Victoria's Secret show was later called the end of the supermodel era. The main reason was that the Victoria's Secret angels were getting worse and worse. This wasn't referring to the angel's appearance, but the overall quality of a supermodel, or even a professional model. In his memory, after the older generation of supermodels gradually retired from the stage, the Victoria's Secret angels immediately faced a shortage of new models. Most of the new generation's catwalk skills were almost the same as the catwalk skills of a veteran female guest. Some models who relied on their social media fame to get on the stage couldn't even perform the basic catwalk properly. As a result, they attracted more and more disappointment and criticism. Among the new generation, the only one Eric recognized as a supermodel was little KK Carrie Krause. Her unique catwalk gave people a feeling that even the tips of her toes were enchanting. Even an ordinary person who didn't understand fashion would be able to recognize the owner of this pair of shoes after watching little KK's catwalk a few times. However, in his memory, little KK had only been at Victoria's Secret for 3 years before quickly terminating her contract with her employer. She claimed that she wanted to focus on her studies, but even a fool could see that she obviously didn't want to ruin her style at the Victoria's Secret show. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, although the style of the Victoria's Secret show wasn't as gorgeous and mature as later years, it could indeed be called the annual supermodel carnival. Bunchan's dominance, Polly's murderous aura, Kaur's playfulness, and Naomi's queen-like demeanor. Each of them was full of vigor. Even if Big KK accidentally dropped her high heels on the catwalk, she still walked the entire show with her tiptoeing elegance. If the camera didn't show her legs, no one would be able to tell that she was only wearing one shoe. Eric believed that talent was needed to become a supermodel, but he also believed that the huge difference between the new generation of Victoria's Secret and the old generation of supermodels was definitely not due to talent. It was more likely that it was due to the overall impetuousness. Therefore, Eric made a seemingly harsh request to Diane Kruger, who was still an 18-year-old girl. A naturally formed aura was something that couldn't be asked for. However, as long as one was a professional, they could definitely walk on the catwalk like Gisele Bündchen and Carrie Krause. Eric liked Diane Kruger very much. He didn't mind giving her a luxurious show just because of a simple good impression. However, if she wasn't capable enough, not only would she not receive the glory she deserved in the future, but she would also be reduced to a laughingstock. Eric reached out and lifted the chin of Diane Kruger, who had lowered her head due to her uneasiness and inferiority complex. He didn't care about other people's gazes and continued to tidy up a few strands of hair on the girl's forehead. He said, "Look, such a beautiful girl in such a beautiful angelic outfit. Of course, she will have to show her best side on the catwalk in the future. So it's definitely worth it to put in a little more effort now, isn't it?" Diane Kruger answered obediently. Eric's gentle tone made her feel less nervous, more at ease, and an inexplicable attachment. Although Eric's fingertips had moved away from her delicate chin, the remaining touch seemed to be supporting the girl's delicate face, preventing her from lowering her head again. "Then it's decided." Eric nodded with a smile and said to Edward Lazek beside him, "I'll leave it to you. Don't delay it for too long." Edward Lazek immediately said, "No problem. Give me 3 days." At this time, Eric finally noticed the sudden silence of the crowd around him. He was a little confused, but he just clapped his hands and said, Then the program ends here. Everyone go back to your work. Following this command, which was not really an order, the crowd, who used to be a little undisciplined, quickly dispersed this time, as if they would be swallowed by some ancient behemoth if they were any slower. After sending Diane Kruger to change her clothes and leave, Eric took out the tape that had just been played from the tape recorder and said to Edward Lazek, "These songs won't do. What I want is the kind of explosive rock music that makes people's blood boil. At the same time, it needs to have the arrogance and unruliness of punk. It's best if it's mixed with some emotional hardcore elements. Of course, the singer's voice also needs to be smooth and full of vitality, so you need to look for it from those mainstream rock albums." Edward Lazek was just the operations director of a lingerie brand. He didn't understand a lot of terms that came out of Eric's mouth at all. He couldn't help but complain in his heart, "Maybe only you know what you want." However, after this idea came up, Edward Lazek immediately thought of the single New Divide that Eric released a few years ago. He probed, "Eric, do you think New Divide is okay?" "No, the atmosphere of that song is enough, but the rhythm doesn't match the fashion show at all." Eric immediately shook his head and denied, but soon he had the same idea as Edward Lazek. Eric himself didn't have enough time to listen to a lot of music to choose a suitable BGM, but judging from Edward Lazek's performance, it was difficult for the staff below to understand the music style he wanted. After a little consideration, Eric said, "Forget it, you don't need to look for it. I'll do the 6 songs myself." Judging from the amazing performance of New Divide that year, Edward Lazek didn't doubt that Eric could write rock music that matched the theme. However, there were 6 themes in the Victoria's Secret show. According to Eric's requirements, the 6 songs had different styles. Edward Lazek suddenly doubted whether Eric could really write 6 songs with completely different styles. Not only Edward Lazek, but Cindy Crawford, who had just recovered from the pressure that Eric had just shown, also had the same doubts. The intersection of the modeling and music circles was still quite a lot, so she was very clear that in the music circle, the highest status was often not those singers who were surrounded by the spotlight, but the top musicians. Even many A-list singers, in order to get an excellent song, did not hesitate to undress for these musicians. From this, it could be seen how rare a good song was. Eric had bullied a lot of people when he was a film director. If he showed the same talent in music, he would probably become a public enemy of MTV. Ignoring the doubts of the people around him, Eric had already opened a thick project planning book next to him. There were a total of 6 themes for the first Victoria's Secret. Other than the theme of British invasion, which was based on the British elements, there were also 2 themes, Dark Demons and Snowdance Fairies, which were based on the 2 mainstream primary colors of black and white. Victoria's Secret also had a sub-brand Pink, which was dedicated to young girls, occupying a Pink Lady theme. The last 2 were the retro style of the United States in the 1920s, Prosperous End, and the popular Feather Element theme, Bird of Paradise. At the beginning, the design team proposed a total of dozens of themes for Eric to choose from. Because he had seen a lot of Victoria's Secret shows in his previous life, Eric unconsciously formed some personal preferences. Even if a designer was talented, imagination was limited after all, which caused these ideas to overlap with many themes in Eric's memory. Because of his subconscious personal preference, Eric involuntarily chose themes similar to those in his memory. This also created a kind of convenience. Eric did not need to search the memory at all to be able to choose the most suitable BGM. Thinking of this, Eric could not help but shake his head and say to himself, "I hope my angel girls won't be robbed of the limelight by this music, otherwise it would be terrible." Cindy Crawford's mouth twitched and almost asked, "Sir, isn't your self-confidence a bit too much?" Edward Lazek also silently complained, but when Eric looked over, he immediately restrained his thoughts. Eric remembered that Katzenberg had just merged the music departments of Firefly and ABC to form a new Firefly Records. Although it was not as good as the major record labels, with the resources of the 2 major media groups, its strength was far beyond those second- and third-tier music companies. After thinking about it, Eric closed the project planning book and said to Edward Lazek, "About the music, according to my previous request, contact Firefly Records." Eric hesitated, But he did not think of the names of the directors of these secondary departments, so he said vaguely, "Contact the person in charge of Firefly Records and ask them to choose some suitable singers and producers." Edward Razek asked, "Do we still need 6 teams?" "There's no need to go through so much trouble. Let them prepare first. I'll come up with the lyrics and music as soon as possible." Eric shook his head. After saying this, he thought for a while and made sure that he did not miss anything else. Then he looked at Cindy Crawford, who had been waiting for a long time. "Miss Crawford, let's talk about your matter next." At this time, Cindy Crawford was still wearing the sexy lingerie from before. When she saw Eric signal to a separate office, the girl, who was thinking quickly, suddenly dismissed the idea of changing her clothes and followed Eric charmingly into the office. Almost at the same time, in New York on the East Coast of the United States, Peter Schneider, the head of Disney's animation department, and Roy Disney, who had stood Eric up in the morning, had just walked out of a luxurious private jet. Beside the black Bentley, a bald man with an oily face greeted them with a smile. He shook hands with Peter Schneider and Roy Disney and said, "This baby is not bad, right? If you need it, you can call me at any time. If you like this work, you are welcome to come and vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Mobile users, please read it at m. Chapter 632. The bald man was Ron Perlman, one of the most notorious corporate snipers in the United States in the 1980s. The Wolf of Wall Street had amassed a fortune of more than $1 billion in the 1980s. His most famous hostile takeover was the takeover of the Revlon Cosmetics Company, which was worth more than $1 billion, with a capital of $150 million. Because of his aggressive takeover, almost every takeover would lead to lawsuits. However, since 1990, when Deckhong Securities, which was famous for issuing junk bonds, was forced to liquidate by the federal government due to a large number of defaults, Ron Perlman, who had a close relationship with Deckhong Securities, began to restrain himself. However, it was only on the surface. As the Wolf of Wall Street, who was always waiting for an opportunity to capture his prey, his nature of waiting for an opportunity to strike was absolutely impossible to change. Recently, Ron Perlman was keenly aware that another opportunity was coming, so he quickly bought $400 million of long-term bonds from Firefly Group through his Drew Holdings. He also contacted 2 other important figures within Firefly Group, the head of Disney's animation department, Peter Schneider, and the art consultant of Disney's animation department, Roy Disney, who was also a member of the Disney family. When Peter Schneider heard Ron Perlman bragging about his private jet, he was envious. He also decided to ask Eric Williams for a commercial jet for Disney's animation department in the following negotiations. Ever since the box office explosion of The Lion King, Peter Schneider had been feeling unprecedentedly happy for the past few days. In the past 2 years, Disney's hand-drawn animation department, including him, had enough of being looked down upon by the group headquarters. The 2D animations they produced were not much worse than Pixar's 3D animations, and the box office of some of their animations even exceeded 2 of Pixar's 3D animations. However, the treatment of the 2 departments was worlds apart. Pixar had a luxurious office park, but they could only squeeze into a dilapidated office building in Burbank. Pixar's employees had generous salaries and bonuses, but their average salary was less than $50,000. Pixar's production budget was almost unlimited, but their department's budget was pitifully small. Pixar was constantly expanding its scale, but they were facing the fate of being laid off. There should be an explanation for all of this, Peter Schneider thought bitterly. At the same time, he could not help but imagine Eric Williams, who he had stood up, sitting blankly in his office. With the current popularity of The Lion King, both the internal and external media had no doubt that this 2D animation would not only create an unprecedented box office miracle, but would also easily earn more than $1 billion of net profit for Firefly Group in the next 5 years. $1 billion. What kind of concept was that? Pixar's 2 3D animations combined wouldn't even reach $1 billion in profits. Therefore, most people who were paying attention to the situation did not believe that Eric Williams would continue with the original Pixar company's original plan. Although Firefly Group had been insisting on the original plan recently, Peter Schneider believed that no matter how stupid a person was, it was impossible to cut off the production department that could produce an animated film with a profit of more than $1 billion. The current situation was definitely just a stalling tactic by Eric Williams. It was only due to the arrogance and stubbornness of a young man, and the stinginess of a capitalist. Eric Williams must have realized that he had made a series of fatal mistakes in Disney's hand-drawn animation department, but he did not want to pay too much compensation later, so he took this obvious stalling tactic. However, Peter Schneider and Roy Disney, who thought they had seen through everything, would never let Eric Williams, a greedy capitalist, succeed. They had already made up their minds. This time, not only would they get the treatment and salary they deserved, but they also wanted Eric Williams to pay enough compensation. Otherwise, they would definitely let Eric Williams taste the bitter fruit of losing Disney's animation department. Ron Perlman's luxurious limousine arrived at a holiday villa in East Hampton after more than an hour. After inviting the two guests into his study, Ron Perlman smiled and took out the cigars he had prepared beforehand. He handed them to the two and said, "Try it. These are authentic Cuban cigars rolled up from the thighs of virgins." Peter Schneider and Roy Disney each took one, and pretended to sniff it under their noses. Then they took the cigar scissors and matches from Ron Perlman. After lighting them, they enjoyed smoking. Ron Perlman did the same. He comfortably blew out a smoke ring and said faintly, "Unfortunately, these are only cigars rolled up from the thighs of virgins, not real virgins. I guess only people in Eric Williams' position can enjoy countless virgins." Peter Schneider sneered and said disdainfully, "There are no virgins in Hollywood." Roy Disney, who was more mature and prudent, frowned slightly when he heard Peter Schneider's complaint that was filled with jealousy and resentment. If he was easily affected by this person in front of him, they definitely wouldn't be able to gain any benefits during the negotiation. From the moment they met, Ron Perlman's attitude had been very warm, and even seemed to be trying to curry favor with him. However, Roy Disney wasn't stupid enough to think that he was a nice guy. In the 1980s, Saul Stamberg, who was also a Wall Street sniper, had maliciously purchased Disney, causing Disney to pay almost a 200% premium to redeem his shares. The bald man in front of him had a much worse reputation than Saul Stamberg. After blowing out another puff of smoke, Roy Disney stopped and put down the cigar in his hand. He said, "Mr. Perlman." "Ron, just call me Ron." Ron Perlman continued to smile like a Maitreya Buddha. "I think we will definitely become friends and partners in the future." Roy Disney didn't dwell on this issue. He said, "Well, Ron, you should know that cooperating with you to deal with our parent company is a complete betrayal. If we don't pay attention, we might be kicked out of the company for nothing. So Peter and I need to know all your plans, all of them. If you hide anything from us, our cooperation will be canceled immediately." Ron Perlman didn't immediately answer Roy Disney's question. Instead, he said in a flattering tone, "Since the two of you are here, I think you must have formed an alliance with all the employees in Disney's animation department. Firefly Group will definitely realize this. With the current situation, even if they find out that you are in contact with me, they won't dare to fire you and risk angering the public." Obviously, Ron Perlman had the same idea as most people. Not only would Eric Williams not eliminate the hand-drawn animation department, but he would also increase his efforts to rope in the hand-drawn animation department to prevent this fat piece of meat from falling into the hands of others. Ron Perlman had placed a $400 million bet on this very point. When Roy Disney heard Ron Perlman's words, he only smiled mysteriously. Peter Schneider, on the other hand, blurted out proudly, "Of course we." Fortunately, Peter Schneider wasn't a fool. When he felt Roy Disney suddenly kick his leg a few times, he immediately shut his mouth and didn't reveal any more information. Ron Perlman now realized that if Peter Schneider was alone, he could definitely play this guy to death. Unfortunately, Roy Disney, this old fox, was here, so he had to keep his guard up. He gestured for them to wait, got up and walked to the filing cabinet next to him. He took out a prepared document and distributed it to the two of them. He said, "As of now, Andrew Holdings holds $400 million of Firefly Group's long-term bonds. Therefore, Firefly's performance will also affect the interests of us creditors. Firefly Group has been very profitable in recent years, but everyone knows that whether it's the movie business or the television business, the profit prospects are very unstable. In order to protect our own interests, we will never watch the shareholders who control the Firefly Group arbitrarily abolish or reform the profitable business departments under their company. Roy Disney ignored Ron Perlman's seemingly righteous words. Instead, he keenly grasped a detail and asked, "What do you mean by we?" Ron Perlman didn't beat around the bush at all. He explained, "Of course I'm talking about me. There are many other creditors of Firefly Group." Peter Schneider opened his mouth, but this time he didn't speak rashly. Roy Disney was also not in a hurry to ask Ron Perlman who the other creditors were. He reached out his hand and said, "Okay, please continue." According to the information I received, Ron Perlman continued as if he didn't mind being interrupted. Next month will be the month when the Firefly Group releases its financial report for the first half of the year. Due to the excellent profit results, next month will also be the time when the Firefly Group's 80% USD bond sales are completed. By then, Firefly Group's accumulated debt will reach $10 billion, which is equivalent to 30% of its total market value. In order to ensure that the principal and interest of this huge debt of $10 billion can be fully repaid. Ron Perlman paused. The expression on his shiny face suddenly became a little fanatical. He slowly revealed his ultimate goal. "I hope that by then, all the creditors will unite and publicly put pressure on Firefly Group. They will enter Firefly's board of directors as creditors." Chapter 633. Los Angeles, in a simple office in the studio of Firefly Studios. Cindy Crawford felt that she was just asking for trouble. Her agent, Jeremy, was carefully reading the same endorsement contract as Linda Evangelista and Christy Durrington. The annoying man opposite her, who seemed to have nothing to do, was looking at her with interest. If his eyes were filled with infatuation, desire, and even undisguised desire, she wouldn't feel anything. She might even be a little proud. However, this man's eyes didn't look like he was looking at a beauty at all. It was more like he was admiring a beautiful pet. The office door was gently knocked. After getting permission, a staff member brought in Cindy Crawford's clothes. Cindy Crawford didn't want to find a room to change out of her underwear. She directly put on the black dress in the office. She was finally relieved. She sat back on the chair and stared at Eric with a little dissatisfaction. Eric smiled faintly and said softly, "You're prettier in clothes." "Mr. Williams," Cindy Crawford finally couldn't help but retort. "Are you talking about a Barbie doll?" Eric shook his head and said, "Of course not. You're much prettier than a Barbie doll." "Oh, but I know a girl who looks just like a real Barbie. People can't help but want to pinch her little face when they see her." Cindy Crawford noticed that Eric suddenly revealed a gentle and even doting smile when he said those words. A trace of jealousy appeared in her heart. How could this despicable guy be so engrossed in thinking about other women in front of a beauty like her? And with such a gentle expression on his face, it was simply unreasonable. Thinking of the recent situation, the anger and grievance in Cindy Crawford's heart surged out again. After hesitating for a moment, she finally couldn't help but reveal a resentful and weak expression as she said, "Mr. Williams, I'm already 28 years old this year." Eric wasn't stingy with the compliments unique to Westerners. He said, "Compared to other supermodels, you're really well maintained. I believe you'll still be so beautiful 10 years later." Although she didn't hear much sincerity from Eric's tone, Cindy Crawford still felt a lot better. However, her tone became more bitter. "But as a model after 30 years old, I can't compete with the new generation. I spent half a year to get a chance in Hollywood, just to continue my career. Why do you have to make things difficult for a little woman like me?" Eric smiled and said, "Do you also think I deliberately ruined your role?" Cindy Crawford didn't answer, but she gave him a look that said, "Isn't it?" Eric said, "This matter has something to do with me, but I didn't ruin your role. Instead, there's a problem with the movie project. Moreover, if everything goes according to the established trajectory, that film will be your starting point in Hollywood, and also your ending point." Cindy Crawford thought of Joe Silvo's gloomy face that night and immediately understood Eric's words. However, she quickly found another loophole and said, "The role that originally belonged to me fell into Claudia Schiffer's hands. How do you explain this? Aren't you worried that this film will become Claudia Schiffer's Hollywood terminal? This is an unexpected situation. Joe Silvo wanted to use Claudia to get me involved." Eric didn't deny his relationship with Claudia at all. He said, "I didn't know about it beforehand, and I didn't plan to interfere afterwards. As for the impact, it's only for you. Not to mention that Joe Silvo will definitely make adjustments to the project. Even if Claudia screws up, do you think I'll let her be affected?" Cindy Crawford felt a sense of powerlessness in her heart. She moved her lips but didn't say anything. Jeremy, who had been secretly listening by the side, finally breathed a sigh of relief. He was a little glad that Eric didn't mind Cindy Crawford's little provocation. He also understood that Cindy Crawford's role in the whole matter was a little bug that was accidentally stepped to death by a passerby. Cindy Crawford's accusation of Eric was like a little bug's relative overreaching and accusing a passerby of murder. Not only would it not attract the attention of the passerby, but it would also make people feel ridiculous and ridiculous. When the two of them quieted down, Jeremy was about to do his duty as an agent to discuss the contract with Eric. However, when he thought of what had just happened, he suddenly felt that it might be more appropriate for Cindy Crawford to speak up herself. A beautiful woman would always be more lenient. Although Cindy Crawford's public popularity was higher than Linda Evangelista and Christy Durrington's, Jeremy wasn't dissatisfied with being treated the same as the other two in the contract. He just pushed the contract in front of Cindy Crawford and pointed to a clause that he felt needed to negotiate. When Eric saw the two of them gesturing, he took the initiative to say, "If you want to discuss it in private, I can step away." "No need." Cindy Crawford quickly raised her head and said to Eric, "Mr. Williams, we have no objections to this contract. However, isn't a 5-year contract a little too long?" Eric said, "If you think it's too long, we can sign a 2-year contract." Cindy Crawford and Jeremy looked at each other. The two of them almost thought that they had misheard. Isn't he too easy to negotiate with? However, Eric didn't let them down. He quickly said, "However, before making a decision, you can take a look at the contract. It should be page 7. I don't remember which clause it is. The contract states that Party A will use its media resources to assist its spokespersons to increase their personal popularity and public influence. However, if you don't want to sign a 5-year contract, LTD and Firefly can't invest too much resources in you. Not only that, but we will also train your successor from now on and pour the media resources that originally belonged to you into her. When your contract expires, that girl can directly replace you. In fact, the channels for models to establish and maintain their fame were very narrow. In addition to those unconventional scandals with movie stars, singers, or sports stars, the more orthodox way was to continuously appear on magazine covers. Therefore, people would always see the introduction of some supermodels that had appeared on the cover of many well-known magazines. Jeremy also noticed the contract that Eric mentioned just now, but because this clause was too general and didn't give any specific promises at all, he didn't pay attention to it. At this time, when they heard Eric mention the inherent relationship between this clause and the 5-year contract, the two of them suddenly realized the value of this seemingly insignificant contract. Firefly was a huge media group that was involved in all kinds of mainstream media, such as movies and TV, and its media resources were absolutely incomparable to those of print media. For example, if one could get the opportunity to be the heroine of a movie under Firefly, the influence would be absolutely no less than that of appearing on 100 magazines. And the more famous a model was, the more endorsement fees they would receive from companies. In the contract that Eric gave, although it stipulated that endorsement work related to Victoria's Secret must be the first priority at all times, it didn't prohibit them from accepting endorsement contracts for other products, except for the internal brands in the same industry. Therefore, if Firefly gave them media resources according to the contract, Cindy Crawford believed that her future endorsement value would definitely be much higher than before. Although she was already tempted, Cindy Crawford was smart enough to ask, "Mr. Williams, about this clause, can you be more specific?" More specifically, for example, movie roles, guest appearances in TV dramas, talk show guest invitations, interviews with traditional print media, online media publicity, and so on. Even if you write a book on beauty and maintenance, as long as it's not too bad, Firefly can help you contact the publishing and marketing companies for you. Because the popularity of the 5 main spokespersons in the future also means the exposure of Victoria's Secret brand, so you can rest assured that Firefly will never be stingy with these resources. After a pause, Eric looked at Cindy Crawford's beautiful face again and said, "In fact, there is a very good opportunity now. If it's not for the timing, I can recommend you to try the role of the 17th 007 Bond girl. Although the previous 007 Bond girls were all pretty faces, the role in this one is very different from the previous ones. It will definitely bring good fame to the actress." Eric was talking about the villain Bond girl played by Famke Janssen in GoldenEye, in his previous life. The wildness, arrogance, bloodthirstiness, and madness of the Russian female agent left a very deep impression on the audience. It also opened Famke Janssen's Hollywood scene. Compared to the unlucky Vase character in Competitive Game, this villain Bond girl was definitely 100 times better. However, Famke Janssen had already started filming the 5th X-Files and couldn't squeeze out any time. Eric could only let MGM choose the right candidate. Cindy Crawford was just about to try to get Eric to specify these promises in the contract, but when she heard his last sentence, her eyes suddenly lit up. She said, "Mr. Williams, I can prepare for the show while acting. You have just seen my walk. I believe I definitely don't need to undergo a long preparation training like those rookies, right?" As she spoke, the girl threw a flirtatious look at Eric. Eric shook his head unmoved. "No, you can only choose one." "Then and you can only choose the first option." Cindy Crawford was stunned for a moment before she realized that she could only choose the former. Disappointment flashed in her eyes, but the girl still grumbled unwillingly, "Mr. Williams, you're really unreasonable." The girl's smooth flirtatious changes made Eric want to subdue the demon again. Why did he say again? Eric coughed and threw away these messy thoughts. He said, "If there are no other questions, I will contact Miss Emily Brighton. You can sign the contract tomorrow." Cindy Crawford still wanted to say something, but Eric waved his hand to stop her. "Miss Crawford, I know what you want to say. The clause about the media resources is indeed a bit general, but you should know that even if I remove this clause, not many supermodels will reject this contract. Although the endorsement fee of $10 million over 5 years is not the highest, and the workload is a bit heavy, there are not many in the modeling industry who are worth more than this. As long as we can work well together, I will definitely not be stingy with the rewards." After Eric finished speaking, Cindy Crawford wisely chose to stop. She said, "Then I have no more questions, Mr. Williams." "Okay, then let's talk about my requirements." Eric glanced at Cindy Crawford again and asked, "How much do you weigh now?" Cindy Crawford suddenly felt a little embarrassed. Because she had been busy entering Hollywood in the past 6 months, she was no longer as cautious about her body size as before. After hesitating for a moment, the girl answered honestly, 136 pounds. 136 pounds was equivalent to 61 kilograms. For Cindy Crawford, who was nearly 1.8 meters tall, it was not considered overweight at all. However, Eric remembered Cindy Crawford's figure when she just put on her underwear. He shook his head and said, "In 2 months, I want to see a beautiful vest line. Is that okay?" Cindy Crawford thought to herself, "Can I say no?" But this thought only turned in her mind. She flirtatiously changed her posture to show off her curves and said teasingly, "Of course, Mr. Williams. But I already have a vest line. Maybe you didn't notice it just now." Eric smiled and nodded. "It's okay. There will definitely be another chance next time." Of course, Eric understood the hint in the girl's tone. It was just that he was more used to hunting than being the prey. Cindy Crawford realized that her obvious hint did not make Eric take the initiative to invite her to a date. She awkwardly said a few more polite words and agreed on a time to sign the contract. Then she left with her agent. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Kelly Haynes pushed open the door and walked into Eric's office in the studio. She found that there was a black piano in the room. Sitting beside the piano, Eric was playing an unfamiliar song. Although the notes under Eric's fingertips were a little choppy, the sad and languid melody still had a lingering influence. It made people unconsciously feel a sense of despair that almost made them cry. Kelly, who was holding a few thick documents, leaned against the door in a daze. She looked at the back of the focused figure in a daze. You are already so outstanding, so dazzling, and so powerful. What else can make you feel so lonely? The piano suddenly stopped. Eric picked up a pencil and was about to add something to the unfinished score when he felt the presence behind him. He turned around and saw Kelly standing there with tears in her eyes. Her expression was full of motherly pity. Eric quickly got up and went to Kelly's side. He took the thick stack of documents and threw them aside. He hugged the woman in his arms and said gently, "Why are you crying?" Kelly, who was in Eric's arms, suddenly felt shy like a little girl. She shook her head and said softly, "No, I brought the report you wanted, and a letter from Mr. Buffett." Eric recalled Kelly's expression and suddenly smiled. "You've been here for a while, haven't you?" Kelly nodded and said, "I knocked on the door but you didn't hear me." Eric more or less understood what was going on. He shook his head and said, "It seems that I really failed." Kelly did not understand what Eric was talking about. Eric had already taken her little hand and sat down on the bench beside the piano. He said, "Come and see the new song I wrote. Do you know how to play the piano?" "Yes." Kelly nodded. She took the score that Eric had only completed a small part of it and scanned it. Her delicate fingers could not help but place on the piano keys. The tune from just now started playing again without any hindrance. Eric could instantly tell that Kelly's piano skills were definitely 10 streets ahead of his. He said, "If I had known, I would have asked you to come over. I wouldn't have had to write so painfully." Kelly picked up the pencil and corrected a few small errors in Eric's score. She asked softly, "Why did you write such a sad song?" "It's a background song for a big show. However, your reaction was not what I wanted. That's why I said that it was a failure just now." Eric's fingers gently slid across the piano keys. He said, "This song is not to express sadness, but the feeling of disillusionment after one's dream is shattered. In the story, a high-spirited young man chased after the illusory dream in his heart for half his life and became successful. When he suddenly looked back, he realized that things had changed. A luxurious life was not what he wanted. The girl back then was no longer the angel in his imagination. However, she did not want to wake up. Thus she sank, and died in the vanity." Kelly looked at Eric's side profile in a daze and muttered, "The Great Gatsby?" "Yes." Eric smiled and leaned over. He kissed Kelly gently on the lips and said half-jokingly, "Can you not be so smart? This will give me a lot of pressure." Kelly's eyes were filled with infatuation and worship. She said, "Who can be as smart as you? I've studied piano for so many years, but I could never write such a song. Please don't worship me. It will make me feel like a liar. You have already cheated me of everything." Kelly blurted out in a daze, but then she regretted it. Her face was red and her eyes were evasive. She mumbled, "Then what is the name of this song?" "In the Prime of Youth." Eric placed half of the score on the shelf and said, "Play it. I'll sing it for you." The slow melody sounded once again. Eric took a moment to prepare himself before singing softly. Although his slightly hoarse male voice couldn't compare to Lana Darren's innocence and desolation, it had a different kind of decadent air to it. "Seen all the prosperity, experienced all the vicissitudes of life. My heart is tired. Indulged in a life of luxury, drinking from cup to cup, like smoke passing by. Midsummer night. End of July. We were young and frivolous, unafraid of the passing of time. We indulged in time, until the evening lights were lit. When the prime of youth is gone, my face is gone. Will you love me as before, despite the long years? When the noise is gone, covered in wounds, will you love me as before, until the end of time?" To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come and vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Mobile users, please read it at m. Chapter 634. After an unknown period of time, the office was still filled with an inexplicable, ambiguous atmosphere. Kelly Haynes sat across the desk in a demure manner, holding a pencil in her hand and supplementing Eric's score according to her memory. Occasionally, she would answer the questions of the man opposite her. Regarding Eric's discovery of Ron Pullman's purchase of Firefly's bonds in the Los Angeles Times in the morning, both Katzenberg and Chris from New York concluded that there was no need to worry. Buffett, who had the same opinion, even gave Eric a detailed handwritten letter in an attempt to reassure him. Due to the many precedents, it was not difficult to guess Ron Pullman's intentions. The Wolf of Wall Street probably wanted to take advantage of the turmoil caused by Firefly's internal reform of the animation department to unite with other creditors to enter Firefly's board of directors, obtain a position on the board of directors, and participate in the group's operations and management decisions. Looking at it from a long-term perspective, this was only the first step of Ron Pullman's plan. After successfully entering Firefly's board of directors, Ron Pullman only needed to wait for the moment when Firefly's operations were in trouble. Film and television media had always been a very risky industry. Although Hollywood had experienced 100 years of ups and downs, it was still the same few major film companies. But in fact, the owners of these film companies had changed countless times. Every time a film company faced bankruptcy because of a failure of a film, the original owner could voluntarily, or be forced to transfer the company to the next company. After the completion of the bond issue, Firefly's accumulated debt would reach $10 billion. According to the various interest calculation formulas of different bonds, the total amount of repayment was estimated to be around $15 billion. Based on the average 10-year bond, Firefly's annual debt payment would be $1.5 billion. Of course, this was only theoretical data, although it seemed like this number even exceeded Firefly's annual profit in the past few years. But in fact, based on Firefly's annual market value and revenue growth expectations, as well as the complicated tax reduction system, this expense would not be a burden to Firefly. But all of this had a premise, and that was Firefly's business performance had to be maintained in good condition. However, in the minds of all industry professionals, it was almost impossible for a media company with film and television as its core to maintain a stable performance level. Perhaps in the next 1 or 2 years, the failure of a few big-budget movies or TV series could cause Firefly Group's finances to be tight. Moreover, in the case of the locomotive lacking in power, the domino effect would also cause the downturn of other businesses, and thus form a vicious cycle. Ron Pullman was waiting for that moment in the future. Once Firefly Group was in trouble, the creditors could use the excuse of protecting the safety of their own funds to propose a debt-to-equity swap request to the FTC and Firefly's board of directors. This way, the creditors would become the owners of Firefly Group. In the original space-time, MGM, which was burdened with huge debts, was on the verge of being taken over by creditors more than once. In Buffett's handwritten letter, the sharp-eyed investment tycoon analyzed that Ron Pullman's plan to launch this attack was most likely to rely on the cooperation of Disney's hand-drawn animation department to put pressure on Firefly's shareholders. Buffett said that if he hadn't seen the information from that night, he would have judged that Eric would protect Disney's hand-drawn animation department at all costs because of the huge profits that Lion King was expected to generate. This could also be used as a bargaining chip by the creditors to blackmail Eric into joining the board of directors. However, since Eric already had sufficient reasons to reform Disney's animation department, Ron Pullman's bargaining chip was no longer valid from the beginning. Buffett also sincerely expressed that even if something else happened, Berkshire Hathaway would stand firmly on Eric's side and would provide the greatest amount of help. After reading the documents, Eric looked up at Kelly and asked, "Have you read Buffett's letter?" Kelly shook her head and asked, "What's wrong?" "Take a look first." Eric handed over Buffett's letter. Kelly quickly read the contents of the letter, thought for a moment and said, "I don't think there's a problem. Buffett makes a lot of sense." "That's not what I'm talking about. Look at the last paragraph." Kelly read the last paragraph and frowned slightly. She thought for a moment and said, "Buffett promised that Berkshire Hathaway would stand firmly on Firefly's side. It doesn't seem to be a problem." I think it's a good thing. Based on Buffett's personality, don't you think this promise is a little too generous? Kelly smiled and said, Eric, you're too suspicious. I think Mr. Buffett is more likely to be interested in your ability and wants you to be Berkshire Hathaway's successor. Hee. Hearing Kelly's joke, Eric also laughed and didn't harp on this issue. After quickly reading all the documents again, Eric suddenly remembered that Peter Schneider stood him up this morning. He looked up and asked, Did you see Peter Schneider at the high-level meeting today? Kelly said, No, shouldn't he and Roy Disney be on your side? Eric frowned and quickly said, Kelly, can you help me find out where the two of them are? Kelly noticed that Eric's expression suddenly became serious and said, Now. Yes, now right away. Kelly nodded and took out her mobile phone and address book. She started to make calls. Eric picked up a pen and quickly wrote down information about Firefly Group, Disney's animation department, Ron Perlman, Chris Buffett, David West, and so on a piece of draft paper. He also connected the relevant terms with the lines he often used, quickly forming a web. Eric quickly filled in the blank space in the middle of the web with another word. Not long after, Kelly put down the phone and said to Eric, I can't get through to their personal phones. I only heard that Peter Schneider and Roy Disney went to New York. I don't know the details. When Eric heard New York, he basically understood. He said, There's no need to check. They must have gone to see Ron Perlman. Kelly immediately thought of the reason why the two executives went to see Ron Perlman. She asked, Then what do we do now? Eric's smile became a little mysterious. He said, This is a good time to pay them back. Kelly was a little confused. Eric continued, Tomorrow is the premiere of Whimsical Beauty, right? Kelly recalled Eric's schedule and asked, Didn't you say you weren't going to attend? I'm going. I have to go, and we'll all go together. Eric patted the table lightly and said, The three old men in Los Angeles and Chris in New York. Let him fly over tomorrow. Oh, and Katzenberg and Michael Lynn. After thinking about it, Eric did not continue to add people. The people mentioned just now were all closely related to the Firefly Group and shared the same interests. Needless to say, Buffett and the other two were shareholders. Chris was absolutely trustworthy. Katzenberg was the next CEO of Firefly. If he could not be trusted, Eric did not need to continue playing in Hollywood. Finally, Michael Lynn was about to leave, but he was also a small shareholder of Firefly Group. As for the other executives, Eric temporarily dismissed the idea of telling them. After all, the fewer people who knew about something in his mind, the better. Oh, there seemed to be another insider. In the original article on the analysis of the 2D animation industry, Eric specifically asked different staff in the assistant office to collect different information. The final summary work was done by Kelly herself, so she was the only one who could proudly see the full picture of the chain of evidence. Moreover, whether it was Kelly's identity as Eric's first assistant or their current close relationship, Eric did not want to exclude her. Eric looked at Kelly Haynes in front of him and smiled. You come with us tomorrow. After the movie we can talk. Kelly also realized at this time that tomorrow was definitely not as simple as just watching a movie. Something was definitely going to happen. However, Eric's unhesitant trust also made her feel warm in her heart. Then I'll inform them first? Eric shook his head and said, I'll make these calls myself. You can help prepare a few invitations for the premiere. Also, don't forget to send a car to pick up Buffett and the others tomorrow. With Buffett, the three old men will definitely be reluctant to spend money. If they appear on the red carpet in a taxi, I can't afford to lose face. Okay. The Lion King experienced a record-breaking box office of more than $46 million in 3 days in the first weekend. The total box office of the first 7 days in the first week reached an astonishing high of $69 million. Correspondingly, the Western film Law Enforcement, which cost more than $63 million, only had a box office of a little more than $10 million in the first week. Warner's original big production with the purpose of sniping, The Lion King, not only failed to complete its mission, but also fell behind True Lies, Star Trek VII, and Saving Private Ryan. Outside of The Lion King, completely becoming the cannon fodder of the hot summer season. In the face of a direct loss of more than $70 million, in order to account to shareholders, Warner implicated the director, producer, and several corresponding executives of law enforcement, becoming the second batch of unlucky people to be fired from Hollywood after Paramount's Beverly Hills Detective 3. Eric himself did not expect that before future Waterworld, Kevin Costner had already experienced a silent failure. In this time and space, the first Mission Impossible had already entered post-production. Eric had watched the sample in detail. He was very satisfied with the shooting results of Kevin Costner's version of Ethan Hunt and Brian De Palma. Therefore, the only thing that Eric was worried about after Law Enforcement was whether future Waterworld would fall through because of this. If this film did not work, then Flower Pictures would definitely have to face Kevin Costner's exorbitant demand for the sequel to Mission Impossible. The day before July, Eric secretly led the new version of Breakin' Hot Girls to hold a grand premiere in Los Angeles. After Rain Man in 1988, MGM had been silent for 6 consecutive years. During this period, they released no more than 10 films in most of the years, and none of them broke the $100 million box office. After many twists and turns, the two new MGM CEO Frank Marchese and President John Kerry's plan to complete the company's recovery by releasing Bare Peak of the Mountain and The Last Phantom Hero last year also failed. Now, DreamWorks Productions' 10-film production plan and United Artists' relaunch of the 007 series had become MGM's last stand. Once they failed again, MGM's only way out was bankruptcy liquidation, and the company's assets would be auctioned off to repay the huge debt of more than $1 billion. The 75% shares of MGM, held by the French bank Credit Lyonnais, would become a pile of waste paper. Compared to MGM's executives, Credit Lyonnais, and DreamWorks Productions' European shareholders who were nervous, worried, and expectant, Eric's mood was more relaxed. For this film, Eric had put in a lot of effort. From the script to the actors, from the director to the producer, everything was decided by Eric based on his memory. His involvement in the film's production progress and final editing was also far more than other films. From the several test screenings of Breakin' Hot Girls, the filmmakers and the general audience who participated in the test screenings gave enough positive comments. If this film failed again, it could only be said that God didn't bless MGM. As for Eric himself, since his rebirth, he had experienced so much glory. Although he didn't change so much that he started to look forward to failure, he was definitely not afraid of failure. Although he didn't plan to attend the premiere, since he changed his mind and appeared at the scene, Eric did his due diligence. He was interviewed by the reporters on the red carpet, and he deliberately called the 3 girls to his side for a series of photos to satisfy the gossip of the live media. When the 3 old men came out of a luxurious limousine at the end of the red carpet, Eric immediately went up to them. After greeting them, he ignored the media who became even more excited because of Buffett's appearance and led the 3 into the theater. P.S. Today's third update is 12,000 yuan. Star. Chapter 635. The lights in the theater dimmed. After the production and distribution company's logo, hysterical screams came from the sound system. The screen turned bright, and an underground boxing arena full of crazy people appeared in the audience's eyes. In the ring, a slender figure seemed to be struggling under the fierce attacks of a muscular female boxer with a crew cut. However, her opponent's fist did not touch the girl's body at all. With a few quick camera clips, coupled with the rapid-fire commentary of the black host holding a microphone beside the ring, the strength of the 2 female boxers was displayed in front of the audience. The buzz-cut female boxer's valiant figure, which did not have any feminine characteristics, was indeed strong, but the delicate girl's record of 37 consecutive victories made the audience once again fall into a frenzy. In a close-up that flashed by quickly, the girl with a sickly pale face raised her fist wrapped in white bandages to block several attacks from her opponent. She seized an opportunity and was about to fight back when a white light flashed in front of her eyes, instantly affecting her judgment. Her opponent revealed a cruel grin and suddenly attacked with his fist. The girl retreated step by step and finally hit the rough fence of the ring. As she dodged, a sudden iron wire wrapped around the fence cut an obvious bloody wound on the girl's right arm. After the girl avoided a fatal crisis by nimbly moving to the side, there was a muffled bang, and the screen cut out of the boxing arena. The door of the black Buick Boulevard was slammed shut, and the camera deliberately gave a close-up of the Buick Boulevard's Three Shields logo. Some of the audience who thought they were very knowledgeable couldn't help but smile, thinking that this scene was undoubtedly a product placement. John Bosley, the contact person played by Morgan Freeman in the original Bill Murray's role, stood beside the Buick Boulevard and listened for a moment. His sharp gaze swept across the somewhat dilapidated street. The camera switched to a first-person perspective. In John's field of vision, several young men and women appeared in the alley not far away. John's gaze seemed to stop on one of the figures. Then he smiled at the tall figure on the other side and said, "Jill, come with me to meet your future partner." Charlize Theron's character, Gil Monroe, nodded as he followed Morgan Freeman towards the warehouse-like building that emitted faint noises. The two sturdy guards noticed the arrival of Hardedef and his companion. Not only did they not stop them, they even opened the iron gate for them in a fawning manner. Passing through the dark tunnel, John brought Jill to the stands on the second floor. A bald white man noticed John's arrival and came over to greet him. He whispered a few words in his ear. However, Jill had already noticed the two people who were fighting in the ring below the spectator stand. The black-haired girl, who seemed to have been suppressed a moment ago, now had the absolute upper hand. The fierce attacks of the White Fist shadows gradually made the buzz-cut female boxer lose the ability to resist. "That was fast," Jill exclaimed in surprise. John was already standing beside Jill at some point in time. His expression was somewhat solemn as he said, "She's angry." Before she could finish her sentence, the buzz-cut female boxer had already been kicked to the ground by the black-haired girl with a fierce whip kick. There was a burst of fanatical cheers in the venue. John's expression didn't change as he said to Jill, "Let's go." The two figures disappeared at the top of the stairs. The scene rotated and cleverly switched to outside the venue again. A Latino girl wearing a halter top and ripped jeans walked out from the group of young men and women that John had been watching at the entrance of the alley. She had a lollipop in her mouth. The girl giggled and gestured her middle finger at the young men and women. Then, she casually walked toward John's Buick. Walking near the Buick Boulevard, the Latino girl took out the lollipop in her mouth. There was no trace of candy on the tip. Instead, there was a trace of metallic light. Many veteran movie fans in the theater saw this scene and couldn't help but smile knowingly. They all knew that the Latino girl played by Penelope was a car thief, but at the same time, they also realized that the Buick Boulevard was more like a bait. As a movie adapted from a TV series, most of the audience had already confirmed the identities of the three girls. At the same time, they were also more curious about the identities of the three angels. Kate and Penelope's character skills had already been revealed, but Jill, played by Charlie, had yet to show any special skills. All the scenes had only been shot for a little over 2 minutes, but most of the audience had already begun to be brought into the story. This was the effect that the producers wanted. When the car thief played by Penelope put the tool into the keyhole of the car door, the scene returned to the underground boxing arena. The pale-faced black-haired girl sat alone on the empty bench in the lounge. She quietly wrapped a bandage around her injured right arm. John and Jill stood at the door for a while. John took the initiative to walk forward and sit beside the black-haired girl. Jill stood by the door with some admiration and awe. "You only want to win every time, but they don't mind killing you," John sighed silently. There was a hint of admonishment in his tone. "Because I know they can't kill me. That's why I only want to win," the black-haired girl replied calmly. Her tone was very calm, without the slightest bit of arrogance or conceit. It was as if she was just stating an established fact. "It was just an accident. Bernie will take care of it. However, I still suggest that you don't come here anymore." There are too many people who don't follow the rules these days. The black-haired girl had no intention of agreeing. She silently wrapped the bandage around her arm and glanced at Jill at the door. John had no intention of continuing to dissuade her. He gestured to Jill and said, "Your new partner, Jill Monroe." Jill, this is Selena Garrett. Selena glanced at Jill and ignored the girl's greeting. She continued to ask, aren't there two? John smiled and said, the other one is outside. Let's go. Penelope Cruz's character, Lucini Baker, had already realized that she was in trouble. As usual, she only took a few seconds to open the car door. However, after a few minutes, not only did she not find the fuse, but the door was also mysteriously locked. Like a bird that had fallen into a trap, Lucini struggled for a while. Just as she was about to find something to smash the window of the Buick Boulevard to escape, the door to the front passenger seat was pulled open. A kind-looking black uncle smiled at her and said, I specially chose your favorite car. How do you feel? Lucini opened her mouth wide in surprise. She was stunned for a second before her expression turned innocent. She waved her arms and said, haha, good evening, sir. I came in to say hello. I didn't expect there to be no one in the car. Ha 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 ha. Following the girl's cute quibble, everyone in the theater burst into laughter. However, when John threw a thick stack of documents into Lucini's arms, the theater burst into laughter again. This was because the stack of documents were all photos taken of Lucini when she was stealing cars. What was even more hilarious was that the cars that Lucini had stolen all had Buick's eye-catching 3 Shields logo on them without exception. Looks like Buick has definitely paid a lot of money this time. However, this kind of implantation is really interesting, many film critics in the audience thought. On the screen, Lucini was like a flustered and talkative little magpie. She kept quibbling and even confidently accused John of secretly taking photos of her. The other two girls watched the scene quietly. John said to Lucini slowly, I'll give you 30 minutes to drive the car to Malibu 10880. Otherwise, I'll hand you and these photos over to the police for investigation. The talkative little magpie immediately quieted down. The roar of the engine could be heard. The Buick Linden drove forward for more than 10 meters before it made a clean drift and drove onto the main road. Lucini's voice could be heard from the Buick Linden that was shuttling through the traffic like a fish. Will you let me go if you drive to Malibu 10880? I'll leave you with a private job. No, I don't want to be sentenced to 180 years like my dad. If you want me to open the safe, I'd rather be handed over to the police. We guarantee the legality of the operation. You're the FBI. No. CI. No. Me 6. No. Don't tell me it's KGB. A few impatient voices could be heard at the same time. Shut up. As the Buick Linden drove further and further away, the explosive rock music started to play. The official opening once again gave the audience a big surprise. Eric used the opening style of the David Vinci version of The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo in his memory. Seeing the male sculptures wrapped in a strange black liquid being slowly smashed one by one, many filmmakers and audiences could not help but think of the naked woman in the 007 film. A strong feminist style, tit for tat with the 007 series. A female film critic at the scene was so excited that she quickly wrote this sentence on her notepad. She could not help but mutter to herself, I'm really looking forward to it. I wonder how much of the 007 series can this film reach? Although there were some small Easter eggs waiting to be discovered in the opening minutes, Eric did not continue to delve into the actual plot. It was somewhat similar to the original plot. The core code of the latest online email service developed by Knox Network Technology was stolen. Once the core code was used, it would pose a threat to the information security of tens of millions of users. At the same time, the person in charge of the development of the code, Eric Knox, was also kidnapped. The three angels received the mission to rescue Eric Knox and retrieve the core code. There was no doubt that Eric's setting was to promote Yahoo's online email service. This was because Yahoo was the only online email service provider on the internet. Even if the name was changed, everyone knew which company the Knox Network Company was referring to. When the script was first discussed with the several people in charge of Yahoo, because of the theft of the core code, Ian Neer and the others were worried that the users would believe it. However, after Steve Mitnick read Eric's script, he even said to Eric in a mocking tone, "That's ridiculous. Let's film it." Eric did not mind this technical maniac's mockery. After all, it was just a movie. Of course, Eric knew some things. The core code of the online email service had tens of millions of lines. It was definitely not something that one person could write. Furthermore, the core code was stored in a secret server cluster that only a few of Yahoo's core executives had access to. Even if the person in charge was really kidnapped, in Steve Mitnick's words, to move the server cluster with Yahoo's core code, they would need at least a few container trucks. The premise was that the kidnappers would have to accurately locate the servers in Yahoo's huge data center. However, in Eric's setting, the core code was only stored on a 2.5-inch floppy disk. Wasn't that ridiculous? After the movie was released, Yahoo would release a few articles to explain the situation, and it would easily resolve the users' concerns. Of course, a professional like Steve Mitnick would definitely find such a setting ridiculous, but in the mid-90s, where many ordinary people hadn't even come into contact with personal computers, such a setting wouldn't arouse too many people's doubts. Instead, it gave people a sense of technological sophistication. Selena, the girl without three, who was both sickly and strong, Jill, the computer genius, and Lucini, who was cute and talkative but had the ability to unlock all locks, worked together more and more tacitly in the process of the missions that were full of surprises. The great villain scheme was also slowly unraveled. A movie that saved the world would always end up in the villain's secret base, and Thunderbolt was no exception. In a secret base deep in the Nevada desert, the angels who had fought their way into the villain's headquarters were having their final battle. Not long after the battle began, Lucine, who had helped her partner break through the base's gate, was accidentally separated. There was no time to worry. Selena and Jill ran into a swarm of enemies. Selena defeated all the brawny NPCs and, as usual, took down the talkative villains. Finally, she and Jill arrived at the central control room covered in wounds. Jill's index finger flew across the keyboard. Soon, she looked at a computer screen and said worriedly, "The virus program has been activated. It will be released in 10 minutes. The only thing we can do now is to inform everyone to cut off the internet to prevent the world's large amount of computer data from being destroyed." Selena asked, "Can't we stop it?" "The virus program has been encrypted. This kind of encryption can only be cracked by an exhaustive method. Based on the computing speed of the computers here, it will take 190 years to crack the code, but we only have 10 minutes. After a pause, Jill continued, "Unless we have a supercomputer, then we might only need a few minutes to crack the code." Author's note: 9 o'clock start at you're tuning in to the Earbook Haven YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.